There is a particular sound a grown man makes when something drags him across frozen ground in the middle of the night. And by the time the sun tried to rise that morning, I had heard it 3 separate times without once understanding what it was. The first time, I told myself it was the ice on the sound, groaning the way it does when the cold clamps down hard enough to split old timber. The second time, I told myself it was a bull caribou hauling a broken leg through the willows, because a wounded animal will make a noise close enough to a human voice to fool a tired person. The third time I stopped telling myself anything at all, because the third time the sound had a voice folded down inside it, and the voice was calling out a name that I knew, and it was calling that name from a place where no living person could possibly have been. Before I take you out onto that tundra with me, and I am going to take you all the way out to the end of it, let me ask you for one small thing while we still have the light to spare. If the kind of fear that crawls up the back of your neck and settles in to stay is the kind of fear you come here looking for, then go ahead and subscribe and leave a comment down below so this story can find the next person who deserves a sleepless night. A like costs you nothing at all, and it helps this reach people more than you would ever believe. And if this channel ever goes quiet on you, if it vanishes the way people up north sometimes vanish, you can always find your way back to me on my backup channels, SR Belicho and Mr. Belicho and Mr. Geronimo. Now turn down the lights and come with me to Kotzebue. My sector was the whole northwest corner of the state, the country the maps mark out as parks and preserves and monuments, but that everyone who lives up there just calls the land. Kobuk Valley to the east, the Noatak running north of it, Cape Krusenstern out along the coast where the beach ridges stack up like the pages of a book nobody has finished reading. I ran patrols out of the little station in Kotzebue, a town that sits on a thin spit of gravel between the Chukchi Sea and 100,000 square miles of nothing. In summer, I worked the rivers by boat. In winter, I worked them by snow machine. Year-round, when the country needed me faster than a boat or a machine could carry me, I went up in a plane, and the man who flew that plane is one of the reasons I am telling you this at all. It was the tail end of October, the season we call freeze-up, when the sound skins over with new ice and the light starts to collapse. This far above the Arctic Circle, the days do not fade gently the way they do down south. They fall. In September, you have hours of sun. By the middle of November, the sun barely clears the horizon before it gives up and slides back down. And after that comes the long stretch where it does not rise at all, where the world holds itself in a blue kind of gloom for weeks on end. We were in the steep part of that fall, losing minutes of daylight every single day, and everybody in town could feel the long night coming the way you feel a storm in an old break. I was in the station finishing a report when Amanda Lopez raised me from dispatch. Amanda had run the radio for the region for close to 20 years, and in all that time I had never once heard her voice do the thing it did that morning. She was steady. She was always steady. That was the entire point of Amanda. But there was a hairline crack running through the middle of her steadiness, and I put down my pen and I listened. She told me that Matthew Jackson had just walked into the clinic. Matthew was 42 years old, a hunter out of one of the river villages, a man who had spent every autumn of his life on the Kobuk following the caribou the way his father and his grandfather had followed them. The western Arctic herd comes down through that country every fall in numbers that do not seem real when you see them. A river of animals crossing the actual river at a place called Onion Portage, thousands and thousands of them pouring across the water where they have crossed for so many years that the ground itself has been worn into their pathways. Men have hunted that crossing for longer than there has been a written word to describe it. Matthew had gone up there 3 days back with a small party to take his winter meat. He came back alone. He came back on foot, which is a thing you do not do in that country. And he came back with his boat still tied up 40 river miles from where anyone found him, and when they finally found him, he was walking a straight line toward town across open tundra with his rifle held out in front of him at his hip, and he would not put it down, and he would not turn his back on the country behind him, not even to answer a question. Amanda said the medic could not get more than a few words out of him at a time, but the words he did give were these. There had been 6 other people at that crossing when the caribou stopped coming, and there was not one of them left. I want to be careful about how I say the next part because it matters. Matthew Jackson was not a man who scared. I had met him. I had shared a thermos of coffee with him on a gravel bar 2 summers before, and he had struck me as the single most unshakable person I had come across in that whole unshakable country. So when Amanda told me that a hunter of his caliber had abandoned a loaded boat and 40 miles of hard walking rather than spend 1 more hour at Onion Portage, I did not think about bears, and I did not think about weather, and I did not think about any of the ordinary things that swallow people up north. I thought about the way he was carrying that rifle, held out in front of him, refusing to turn his back. The Chief Ranger Daniel Taylor came into the station about 10 minutes later with his coat already half on. Daniel was 50, close to retirement, a careful man who had buried more than one searcher in his career and who had learned the hard way to move slow and think first. He had already spoken with Nicole Martin, the village safety officer downriver, and Nicole had confirmed the names of the party that had gone up with Matthew. A survey crew had gone up to collar caribou during the crossing, and 2 local hunters had gone with them for the meet, and the whole group had been due back the previous afternoon and had missed every scheduled radio check since. Daniel looked at me and he said the thing that neither of us wanted said out loud. He said the weather was closing, we had maybe one window to get out there before the front sat down on us for a week, and if there were people alive at that crossing they did not have a week. He said he needed me and Richard on that plane within the hour. Richard Hernandez was 39 and he was the best partner I ever worked beside. He had come up from the southern part of the state a decade back and had never left. One of those rare people who arrive in the Arctic and find that some part of them had been missing their whole life and was only now being filled. He could read country the way other people read a room. When I found him at the hangar, he already had the packs loaded, the survival gear doubled, the medical kit heavy enough to hurt your shoulder, because neither of us knew yet what we would find, and we had both learned to prepare for the worst version of a thing. The man flying us was Christopher Anderson, 44, a bush pilot who had put more hours over that country than most people have spent awake. Christopher was not a nervous man. Bush pilots cannot afford to be. But when Daniel told him where we were going, Christopher went quiet in a way that I noticed, and he walked out to the plane and he ran his hands over it, checking things he had already checked, taking longer than the job needed. It was while he was doing that, while Richard was strapping down the last of the load, that Lauren Thomas found me. Lauren was 61. She had worn the same uniform I was wearing for 30 years before she retired, and she had stayed in Kotzebue after, the way some old rangers do, because the country will not let you go once it has its hooks in you. She knew that land better than anyone left alive who was not born to it, and the ones who were born to it, the elders in the villages, had taken a liking to her over the decades and had told her things they did not tell many outsiders. She came across the gravel toward me with her collar up against the wind, and she took my sleeve and she pulled me a little way off from the plane where the others could not hear. She asked me where we were going. I told her. Onion Portage. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked past me, out at the country, at the low gray line of it running off to the horizon under a sky the color of a healing bruise. Then she told me that the elders she had known, the old people who were mostly gone now, had one rule for the thing that lives out in the willows. Only one. She said the thing learns your voice. She said it learns the voice of everyone you have ever loved, and it keeps those voices and it uses them. And she said that when you are out there alone and you hear one of those voices call to you from the brush, from a place where no living person you know could possibly be, you do not answer it, and you do not go to it, and you do not stop to be sure. You turn your back on it, and you walk. And no matter what it says to you in the voice that you know, no matter what it promises or begs or how it cries, you do not stop. I told her I would remember. I did not believe a word of it, but I told her I would remember, because she was old and she had been kind to me, and because there was no cost in the promise. Then Christopher called out that the window was closing, and I climbed into that plane, and we lifted off the gravel and turned east up the sound toward the Kobuk, and I watched the town shrink behind us until it was nothing but a scatter of lights on a thread of land in an ocean of pale ground, and then even that was gone. From the air, that country does something to your sense of your own size. There are no roads. There are no towns after the first 10 minutes. There is only the land, going on and on with a patience that has no bottom to it, the tundra stretching flat and endless and the color of old bone, cut through by the black loops of rivers that wander wherever they please because nothing has ever stopped them. Then, further up the Kobuk, the trees begin, not the great forests you might imagine, thin black spruce, stunted and crooked, holding on wherever the permafrost gives them half a chance, growing in ragged bands along the river and thickening as you climb toward the mountains. And out past the trees, catching the low light like something that had no business being there, the great Kobuk sand dunes, 25 square miles of actual desert sitting in the middle of the Arctic. A mistake the land seems to have made and then decided to keep. Christopher flew us up the river low and slow. He knew the crossing. He had put hunters in and out of Onion Portage for years, and he brought us down onto the gravel bar the party had used, a long open stretch beside the water where the caribou trails came down to the river in their thousands. He set the plane down soft and taxied it up onto the high part of the bar where the ice would not reach it, and he cut the engine, and for a moment none of us moved, and in that moment I understood the first thing that was wrong. It was quiet. I need you to understand what that means in that place at that time of year. Onion Portage during the crossing is one of the loudest wild places on the continent. The caribou make a sound like a slow flood. The click of their ankles, the grunt and cough of the bulls, the churn of the water as they come across. There are ravens by the hundred working the edges of it, and gulls, and the whole air is full of the noise of a migration that is one of the last great migrations left in the world. That is what October at that crossing sounds like. We got out of the plane into a silence so complete that my own pulse was the loudest thing in it. The caribou were gone. Not past. Gone. There were fresh trails everywhere. The ground churned to mud, and then frozen hard, sign that thousands of animals had been moving through this exact spot within the last 2 or 3 days. And then the sign simply stopped. It did not thin out the way a migration thins out at its tail. It stopped, as if every animal in that river of animals had reached a certain line on the ground and had decided, all at once, that it would rather not. Richard crouched by the edge of the trails and read them for a while without saying anything, and then he stood up and looked at me, and I could see him choosing his words. He said the herd had turned. He said something had come down out of the trees on the north side of the crossing, and the whole migration had felt it, and the animals had broken and gone back the way they came, thousands of them turning as one, choosing to swim a river twice and climb back into the country they had just left, rather than pass whatever was waiting on the far bank. Caribou are not clever animals, but they are very old, and they carry the memory of every predator that has ever hunted them, and there is a difference between a herd that runs from a wolf and a herd that refuses to cross. A wolf they run from, and then keep moving. This was refusal. This was 100,000 animals looking at something and turning around. We found the camp a quarter mile up the bar, in the lee of a low-cut bank where the crew had pitched their tents in the shelter of the willows. And I have walked into a lot of bad scenes in my years wearing that badge. I have found people who did not make it. I have found the aftermath of things that no report can hold. But I had never walked into a scene like that one, and I have not walked into one since. The tents were still standing. That was the thing that turned my stomach before my mind had caught up to why. The tents were up, staked out and zipped, and inside them the sleeping bags were laid out and the personal gear was stowed the way you stow it when you mean to sleep and wake and go on with your life. There were boots lined up outside the doors. There was a pot of coffee frozen solid on the camp stove, the stove itself run dry hours or days before. There was a rifle leaned against a spruce, loaded, safety on, exactly where a careful hunter leaves a rifle when he steps away for a minute and means to come right back. 6 people had made that camp. There was no sign of a struggle inside it. There was no blood in the tents. There was nothing torn or scattered or broken in the way a bear tears a camp apart. The people who had built that camp had simply stopped being in it, all 6 of them, sometime between laying out their beds and the coffee going cold, and they had left everything a living person needs to survive a night in the Arctic right where it sat. Rachel Moore found the first of the sign, and I will tell you about Rachel now because she matters to the end of this more than anyone. Rachel was 35, a wildlife technician who had flown up with us at the last minute because she knew the survey crew. She had trained 2 of them, and she could not sit in town while they were out here. She was quiet, and she was careful, and she did not miss things, and she was the one who walked the edge of the willows while Richard and I stood in that dead camp trying to make sense of it. And she was the one who went still and did not call out, but simply raised her hand until I came to her. At the back of the camp, where the willows closed in against the cut bank, the ground had been disturbed, not churned, not fought over. Something heavy had been pressed into the frozen mud and then hauled through it, twice, side by side. 2 long grooves running from the open ground into the brush where the light would not follow them. Between the grooves and along both sides of them there were prints. I got down over the nearest one and I put my own gloved hand into it, and my hand, fingers spread, did not fill it. It was the shape of a foot. It had the toes of a foot, 5 of them, splayed and pressed deep, and it was sunk into ground that had held my own weight without leaving a mark, sunk the depth of my whole hand into frozen earth. And from the front of one print to the back of the next, where the thing had taken a single unhurried stride, I measured off more than twice the length of my own longest step. Richard came and stood over it beside me, and he did not say the word. Neither of us said the word. There is a word for this, and every person listening to me knows what it is, and I will tell you that when you are actually standing over the thing itself, with the light dying and the silence pressing in and 40 miles of empty country between you and the nearest other soul, the word does not come to you as a joke or a story. It comes to you as a fact you have to survive. We followed the grooves into the willows only as far as we dared, and then not one step further because of what we found where they led. The brush opened into a little clearing, and in that clearing the willows had been broken. Not chewed, not rubbed the way a moose rubs, but taken in the hands and snapped and woven. Something had bent living saplings across each other and twisted them together into shapes, arches, and lattices, whole sections of the brush bound into a kind of structure that had no purpose I could name, and every purpose my body understood without asking my mind. It was the kind of thing a person makes to mark a place. It was the kind of thing you build around a doorway. And the grooves, the 2 long grooves that had started in the camp where 6 living people had laid out their beds, ran under the largest of those woven arches and out the far side and away into the trees, out past where we could see, out into the country the caribou had refused to enter. That was when Christopher started shouting for us from the bar. Not in fear, in a pilot's flat urgency. The front was coming faster than the forecast, the ceiling was dropping, and if we did not get in the air in the next few minutes, we were not getting in the air at all. And I stood there at the edge of that clearing with the grooves running away into the trees, and everything I was trained to do told me to get on that plane, and everything else in me, the part that had shaken Matthew Jackson's hand and had promised his people I would find their crew, could not make my feet carry me away from those grooves while there was any chance at all that the people who made them were still alive at the far end. I made the wrong choice. I want to be honest with you because I have had a long time to think about it, and I made the wrong choice, and Richard made it with me, and Rachel made it with us. We told Christopher to shut the plane down. We told him we were staying the night, that we would search at first light with what little light we would get, that a crew this fresh, this recently gone might still be found. Christopher looked at the sky and he looked at the trees, and he did a thing I did not understand until much later. He did not argue. He simply nodded, slow, like a man agreeing to something he had already known he would have to agree to, and he went to secure the plane for a night none of us should have spent in that place. And behind us, out past the woven arch, out in the trees where the grooves led and the last of the day was giving up, something that had been holding very still for a very long time began, at last, to move. We made our own camp on the open bar, well away from the dead one, out where the willows could not close around us and where we would have clear ground on every side. This is the first rule when the country turns against you. Do not let it get close without your seeing it come. We built up a fire, not for warmth so much as for the circle of light it threw, and we set a watch, and we ate what we could stomach, which was not much, and we settled in to wait out the longest night of my life. The temperature fell like a stone once the light was gone. Freeze-up nights in that country run cold enough to kill an unprepared man in an hour, and we were not unprepared. We had the doubled gear and the good bags and the fire, but the cold up there is not only a temperature, it is a presence. It leans on you, it gets into the meat of your hands and the roots of your teeth, and it makes the whole world small and mean and close, and it makes every sound carry for miles across the frozen ground. The first knock came a little after full night. It came from the tree line to the north. A single hard crack, wood struck against wood. One clean report that rolled out across the bar and died. We all heard it. We all looked. Richard had the shotgun up and across his knees. Nothing moved at the edge of the trees, which stood as a low black wall against a sky that held just enough of a glow to show it to us. We waited. A minute passed, then 2, and then the knock came again, from a different place, further along the tree line, and then again closer, and I understood that whatever was making that sound was moving, and that it wanted us to know it was moving, and that it was walking a slow circle around the edge of our light. Christopher, who had barely spoken since the crossing, said one thing then, low, almost to himself. He said his uncle had flown that country before him, and his uncle had told him there were places you put down and left, and onion portage after the caribou turned was one of them, and he had broken that rule tonight because the ceiling had trapped him, and he was sorry. He said it like a confession. I told him it was not his fault, that I had made the call. He shook his head and he said it did not matter whose fault it was. Out here fault did not enter into it. Out here there was only what the country decided to keep. The smell reached us maybe an hour into the circling. It came down on a shift of the wind, and it was the worst thing I have ever put into my lungs. It was the smell of an animal, rank and wet and close, the reek of a den that has never been cleaned. But under the animal reek there was something else, something sweet and thick and wrong, the smell of meat that has sat too long, and it rolled over our camp on that one gust, and then the wind changed again and took it away, and every one of us was on our feet with our backs to the fire and our faces to the black. Then the rocks began. The first one came out of the blackness and struck the frozen bar 10 feet from the fire and skittered away into the night. A stone the size of a fist, thrown out of the tree line hard enough that we heard it whistle before it hit. Then another, closer. Then a third that passed close enough to Richard's head that he felt the wind of it. A stone that would have caved in his skull if it had been thrown 1 degree to the left, and it had not been thrown by an arm. It could not have been. No arm throws a rock that size, that far, that hard, and that flat. We put the fire between ourselves and the trees, and we crouched and we waited, and the stones came out of the black in ones and twos, testing us, hurting us, and I understood with a cold certainty that we were being handled by something that had done this before, many times, to many people, and knew exactly what it was doing. And then, from the tree line, in the pitch beyond the reach of our fire, it stood up. I will tell you exactly what I saw, and I will tell you exactly how little that was, because I have thought 1,000 times about what I would give to have seen it clearly, and I have thought 1,000 more about how grateful I am that I did not. It was a shape against a shape. The tree line was black, and the sky behind it held that faint Arctic glow, and against the trees a piece of the blackness detached itself and rose, and it rose, and it kept rising, until the top of it stood well above the highest of the stunted spruce it stood among, and those trees were not short. It had the outline of a man, and it did not have the size of a man, and it did not have the size of anything that has any business standing on 2 legs. It was the width across the shoulders of the doorway to my house, and near the top of it, where a face would be, 2 points of light caught our fire and threw it back at us, low and steady and set too far apart, and they did not blink, and they were the color of a coal that has burned down almost to nothing. Rachel made a sound beside me, not a scream, a small, involuntary sound, the sound a person makes when the world they have believed in their whole life quietly ends. Richard raised the shotgun, and Christopher Anderson, standing at the edge of our little circle nearest the trees, said, in a voice gone flat and strange, that he was going to the plane, that he could reach the plane, that he could get the emergency radio and raise Kotzebue and get us out at first light. And before any of us could stop him, before Richard could get a hand on him, he turned and walked out of the firelight in the opposite direction from the shape, toward the pale bulk of the plane up the bar, and the shadow at the tree line dropped down out of sight. And Christopher walked away from us into the black. We heard him reach the plane, we heard the door. We heard, faint across the bar, the crackle of the radio finding power, and Christopher's voice starting to speak, calling the station, calling Amanda, and I let myself feel 1 clean second of hope. And then the radio stopped, not clicked off. Stopped, the way a voice stops when the breath behind it is taken, and out of the black up the bar, where the plane was, where Christopher was, there came a single sound. It was the sound I told you about at the very beginning, the sound of a heavy thing dragged fast across frozen ground. And it went from the plane toward the tree line in the space of about 4 seconds, 4 seconds to cover a distance that would have taken a running man half a minute. And it went into the trees, and it was gone. And the night closed over the place where it had been like water closing over a stone. We did not go to the plane. God help me. We did not go because we could not. Because to leave that fire and cross that black ground was to die, and we knew it, and we crouched in our circle of light with our backs together and our faces out, and we listened to that country breathe around us, until the sky, hours later, began at last to gray toward a morning that could not come fast enough. The light, when it finally came, was not light so much as a lessening. This deep into the fall, the sun barely troubled the horizon, and what we got was a few hours of a low, sourceless gray, the kind of half-day that makes every shadow lie to you. But it was enough to move by, and the moment we could see the ground we went to the plane, all 3 of us together, none of us willing to be more than an arm's length from the others. The plane was still there. Christopher was not. The door hung open. The emergency radio was still on, still hissing static into the cold, its little light burning. There was no blood in the cabin. There was 1 boot on the gravel beside the door, and there were the 2 grooves, starting right at the plane's step, running away up the bar and into the trees to the north, following the exact line the crew's grooves had followed the day before, and beside the grooves, pressed deep into the frozen bar, were the prints. And this time there were so many of them, overlapping, coming and going, that I understood the thing had been at that plane the entire time Christopher spoke into the radio, standing over him, letting him call for a help that was never going to arrive in time, and had taken him only when it was ready. I tried the radio. I got Amanda. The signal came and went, chewed up by the front sitting down over the mountains, but I got enough words through and enough words back to understand two things. The first was that Amanda had heard part of Christopher's call in the night, enough to know we were in trouble, and that Daniel Taylor had already been trying to launch a rescue since before dawn. The second was that no rescue was coming. The front had closed the whole region. The ceiling was on the ground. Nothing with wings was leaving Kotzebue, and nothing on the ground could reach us across 40 miles of unfrozen tundra and open river, not for days, and Amanda's voice, that steady voice I had leaned on for 20 years, cracked all the way through when she told me to hold on, to just hold on, that they were coming as fast as the sky would let them. I want to stop here for one moment, because you have come this far into the cold with me, and I would like to know where you are while you listen. Tell me in the comments what country you are in, and what the hour is where you sit, whether it is late and quiet like the night I am describing, or the middle of an ordinary day. It helps me to picture you there, safe, on the far side of the screen, while I take you the rest of the way through this. And then come back to the bar with me, because we could not stay by that plane, and we could not fly it, and we had to make a choice, and the choice we made was to walk. There was a shelter cabin. Old survey crews and hunters had used it for decades, a low log structure maybe 8 miles down the river on the same bank, built solid against the cold with a heavy door and a wood stove and shutters that barred from the inside. If we could reach it before the light failed again, we could get walls around us, a fire we did not have to feed all night in the open, a defensible place. 8 miles is nothing in summer. 8 miles across frozen tundra in a few hours of gray half-light, with what had taken Christopher somewhere out in the trees beside us, was the longest walk any of us would ever make. We walked it in the open, away from the tree line, out on the exposed ground where nothing could reach us without crossing distance we could see. We walked fast, and we did not talk, and we watched the trees, and for the first hour nothing came, and I began to let myself believe we might make it. And that was when it started to use the voices. It came from the willows off to our right, a good 200 yards out, and it was Christopher's voice. It called my name, my actual name, in Christopher's exact voice, warm and urgent and relieved. The voice of a man who has been lost in the cold and has just seen his friends and is calling out to them to wait, to help, to come. It called my name, and it said it was hurt. It said its leg was broken. It said please. It said do not leave me out here. And I stopped walking. I could not help it. Every cell in my body turned toward that voice, because it was Christopher. I would have sworn on anything I have ever held sacred that it was Christopher. And Christopher was heard in the willows and calling my name. Rachel grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. She had heard Lauren too. Back at the plane the day before, I had told them both what the old woman said, and Rachel put her mouth close to my ear and she said it back to me. The rule, do not answer it, do not go to it, do not stop. And I stood there shaking with the wrongness of it, because the whole of my heart was pulling me toward that voice, and the whole of Lauren's warning was the only thing holding me on the ground. It learns the voice of everyone you have loved, and it had learned Christopher's voice in a single night, learned it well enough to break me with it, and if I had gone to it, if I had crossed those 200 yards into the brush toward my friend's voice, I would not be here. We did not go. We turned our faces back to the river and we walked. And the voice followed us, changing, becoming other things. It became a woman crying. It became a child, and there was no child within 100 miles of us, and it became a child anyway. A small voice calling for its mother out on the empty tundra. And that one was the hardest of all. That one nearly took Rachel, and Richard and I had to hold her between us and keep her moving while the thing in the willows wept in a child's voice and begged us to come and find it. We reached the cabin as the gray was going out of the sky. We got the door open and the three of us inside, and we barred it, and we barred the shutters, one window at a time, and we got a fire going in the old stove with hands that would not stop shaking, and for the first time in more than a day we had walls, and we let ourselves breathe. And that was when we found what the cabin already held. Because we were not the first people to run to that cabin from the thing at Onion Portage. In the corner, stacked and stowed the way careful people stow their gear, was equipment. Packs, sleeping bags, a rifle, and a radio, and boots lined up in a row. 6 sets of everything, laid out neat by 6 people who had reached these walls before us and barred this door and built a fire in this stove and believed, exactly as we believed, that they were safe. It was the missing crew's gear, every bit of it. They had made it to the cabin, they had done everything right, and whatever had come for them here, behind a barred door and shuttered windows, had not needed the door or the windows at all. because their gear was here and they were not, and there was not one mark of forced entry anywhere in that solid little room. We understood then that the cabin was not shelter. The cabin was a place the thing already knew, a place it had emptied before and would empty again, and getting inside it had not saved the crew any more than it was going to save us. But it was full night now, true night, the long polar blackness with no moon behind the clouds, and to open that door and go back out into it was not a thing a living person could make themselves do. So we stayed, and we kept the fire high, and we sat with our backs to the log wall and our weapons across our knees, and we waited, and outside in the blackness it came for the cabin. It came slowly, the way it did everything, in no hurry at all, because it had never once in the whole of this had any reason to hurry. First the knocks, all around the cabin now, wood on this wall and then that one, walking its slow circle around the little building the way it had circled our fire. Then the smell, worse in the closed space, seeping in through the chinks in the logs until we were breathing it, that den reek, and under it the sweet rot of the thing's larder. Then the pressure of it against the walls, and I mean that as a physical fact. The logs of that cabin, logs a strong man could not have shifted with a pry bar, creaked and flexed inward as something vast leaned its weight against them from outside, testing, and dust sifted down from the roof beams, and the whole structure groaned around us like a ship in a sea. And then it spoke to us through the wall, and it used all of the voices at once. I cannot describe this to you in a way that will let you feel it, and I am glad I cannot, because you should not have to feel it. It spoke in Christopher's voice, and a child's voice, and a woman's crying, and my own name, and the voices of people I have loved who were nowhere near that place, layered and overlapping, coming through the log wall from 6 inches away, and it did not say anything that made sense. It only called, and begged, and wept, working through every voice it had ever stolen, trying each one against us to see which would be the one to make us open the door. And we did not open the door. We put our hands over our ears and we screamed back at it to drown it out, and we did not open the door. And after a while, an hour, 2, I lost all sense of time. The voices stopped, and the pressure came off the walls, and the smell faded, and the country outside went quiet again, and we did not believe for 1 second that it was over. At first light, the last light we would get, we made our decision, and it was Richard who made it, and I have carried what he did every day since. Richard said the thing hunted the walls. It waited us out inside the places we ran to, because it knew, it had learned across who knows how many crews and hunters and lost people, that frightened humans run to walls and stay behind them until the fear or the cold or the thing itself finishes them. So the walls were the trap, the open ground, the exposed river ice now finally hard enough to bear our weight, the long empty flats where we could see it coming and it could not use the brush to close on us unseen. That was our only chance. We would go out onto the open river and we would walk the ice down toward the village, and we would not stop, and we would not run to any shelter, and if it came for us it would have to come across open ground in the light where we could face it. He also said that it would take one of us. He said it plainly, the way Richard said hard things, that a thing that patient and that certain would not simply let 3 people walk out of its country, that it would take one of us to keep the other 2 moving in the direction it wanted, or take one of us simply because it could. And he said that if it came to that, if it came down to it choosing, he wanted it to be him, because Rachel had trained half the crew we had failed to save and deserved to be the one who carried them home, and because I had a family down south and he did not, and he had made his peace with this country a long time ago, and if it was going to keep one of us then it should keep the one who had already given himself to it. I told him to stop. I told him nobody was being kept. He smiled at me, and it was the worst thing, that smile, because it was not afraid, and he shouldered his pack, and we opened the door onto the last gray day, and we went out onto the ice. It came for us in the open, in the light, and it came fast. We were perhaps 2 miles down the river ice, out in the middle where the going was hard and flat, when it broke from the tree line on the north bank and crossed the open snow toward us, and in the daylight, at last I saw it move, and the sight of it moving is the thing that wakes me now in the middle of the night in a warm house 1,000 miles from that river. It did not run the way an animal runs. It covered the ground in long, low, impossible bounds, arms swinging, that whole vast body eating the distance between the bank and the ice faster than a snow machine. And it was on us before we could do more than turn. Richard stepped into it. He did not run. He turned and he raised the shotgun and he stepped toward the thing coming across the snow, and he fired, and I saw the load hit it, I saw it stagger, and I will tell you that it bled. Whatever it was flesh, and it bled and it felt pain, and for one instant I thought the impossible. I thought we might fight it. And then it was on him, and it took him up off the ice in one motion the way I would pick up a child. And Richard fired one more time into it point blank, and then it turned and went back toward the bank in those long low bounds with my partner in its arms. And it was into the trees before the echo of the last shot had crossed the river, and it was gone, and it took him, and the ice where he had stood was empty and marked only with a little blood already freezing black in the cold. Rachel and I ran. Whatever Richard had said about not running, we ran, because there was nothing else in us anymore but the animal need to be away from that place, and we ran down the ice into a wind that was rising and the light was failing, and the snow the front had promised for 2 days finally came, all at once, sweeping down the river valley in a wall of white, and it swallowed the banks and the sky and the world, and it swallowed the little distance between me and Rachel, and somewhere in that white, running, blind, I lost her hand, and I lost her voice, and I lost her. And I was alone on the ice, in a whiteout at the bottom of the year at the end of the world. I do not know how long I was alone in the white. Time does not work in a whiteout. You cannot see your own feet. You cannot see the ground you stand on. You cannot tell up from down or forward from back, and the wind takes every sound and tears it to pieces and throws it at you from every direction at once. And the only reason I was moving in any direction at all was that I had the river ice under me, and I kept the wind on the same cheek, and I put one foot in front of the other, because to stop was to lie down, and to lie down was to die. And then, out of the white, from somewhere off to my left, Rachel called my name. It was her. I want you to understand that it was her voice, that I have replayed it 10,000 times, and it was Rachel Moore's voice, and she was close. She was so close, 30 yards, 40, out there in the white where I could not see her, and she was calling my name, and she was hurt. I could hear it in her voice. She was down, and she was hurt, and she was calling for me to come, to please come, to not leave her. She had fallen, and she could not get up, and the cold was taking her, and she needed me to come and find her in the white. And I stopped. Of course I stopped. She was 30 yards away, and she was dying, and she was calling my name, and I turned toward her voice, and I took one step off my line toward the place in the white where Rachel Moore was calling for help. And I heard Lauren Thomas in my head, as clearly as if the old woman were standing beside me on that ice, saying the thing she had said to me on the gravel in Kotzebue a lifetime before. It learns the voice of everyone you have loved. When you hear that voice call to you from a place where no living person could be, you do not answer it, and you do not go to it, and you do not stop to be sure. You turn your back on it, and you walk, and no matter what it says to you in the voice that you know, no matter what it promises or begs or how it cries, you do not stop. And I turned my back on Rachel Moore's voice, and I walked away from it into the white, and I did not stop. She called after me. She called my name again and again, and then she stopped calling my name, and she just screamed out there in the white behind me, and I walked, and the screaming got further away, and I walked, and it did not stop. It never stopped. It just faded down into the wind until I could not tell it from the wind anymore, and I walked, and I did not go back. And that is how I lived. That is the only reason I am here saying these words to you. Because an old woman told me a rule the elders knew, and I obeyed it, and I turned my back on a voice in the willows, and I walked away, and I lived. They found me 2 days later, at the edge of the village downriver, walking a straight line across the open ice with the wind at my back, and I would not stop walking until they physically took hold of me, and I would not turn around, not even then. Nicole Martin was one of the ones who brought me in. Daniel Taylor came upriver as soon as the weather broke. Amanda Lopez held my hand in the clinic and cried, and I could not tell her much because there was not much I could make my mouth say. When the front finally lifted, they went back up to Onion Portage, all of them, a full team, armed, in daylight, and they searched that country for a week. They found the crew's camp. They found the cabin with its gear. They found the plane where Christopher had spoken his last words into the radio. They found the woven arches in the willows and the 2 long grooves running away into the trees. And they followed those grooves as far as they went, and where they went the searchers would not talk about after. Not to me, not to anyone, and the report that came out of it is sealed and will stay sealed, and I have never asked to read it. They did not find Christopher. They did not find Richard. They did not find any of the 6 from the crew. They found Rachel. They found her out on the river ice, 2 miles below the cabin, at the place where the whiteout had swallowed us. She had fallen and broken her ankle on the rough ice, and she had not been able to get up, and she had lain there in the open and called for help until the cold took her, and the searchers found her there, alone, exactly where I had heard her voice, exactly where she had called my name, and I had turned my back and walked away and lived. She had been real. She had been alive. She had been 30 yards from me in the white, calling my name, and she had not been the thing in the willows wearing her voice. She had been Rachel Moore, hurt and freezing and begging her friend to come and find her. And her friend had heard the elders' rule and had turned his back and walked. And she had died there on the ice with my name in her mouth while I saved my own life by refusing to go to her. That is the part one cannot put down, because I will never know. The searchers found her tracks and they found the thing's tracks both, out there on that ice, close together, and so I will never know whether she was alone when she called me or whether it was already there with her in the white, waiting for me to come to her voice the way it had waited at the plane and waited at the cabin. I will never know whether going to Rachel would have saved her, or whether it would only have killed us both. I will never know whether Lauren's rule was the wisdom that saved my life or the lie that made me abandon a living woman to die alone in the cold 30 yards away. The rule was true. That is the thing I have learned, and it is the thing I leave you with, and it is the reason I still do not sleep. The rule was true, and it kept me alive, and it works exactly the way the elders said it works. When you hear the voice of someone you love calling to you out of the country where no living person could be, you turn your back and you walk, and you do not stop. That is how you survive that place. And it is also precisely and exactly how you leave the people you love to die out there, calling your name, 30 yards away in the white, while you save yourself. The rule that keeps you alive and the rule that damns you are the same rule. There is no way to tell the trap from the truth until it is far too late. And by then you have already chosen, and you have to live with the choice, and I have to live with mine, in a warm house 1,000 miles south of that river, where the country cannot reach me, except that sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and everyone is asleep, I hear it anyway. Out past the window, in the ordinary suburban blackness where there are no willows and no tundra and nothing at all that could be there, a voice I love calls my name, and every single time, God forgive me, I turn my back, and I do not go to it. And I do not stop. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of the ice. If this one is going to sit with you tonight, and I think it might, then do me the kindness of subscribing so you do not lose your way back here. Leave a comment and tell me the truth. Tell me whether you would have gone to the voice or whether you would have walked. Every like carries this story a little further out into the world. And if this channel ever goes quiet on you, if it disappears the way people disappear up north, you can always find me again on my backup channels, Sar Belekyo, and Mr. Belekyo, and Mr. Geronimo. I will keep the fire lit. You come find me. And whatever you do, wherever you are, if you ever hear your own name called from a place where no living person could be, remember the rule, and remember what the rule costs, and then decide for yourself which kind of person you are going to be. The thing that took Robert did not roar. That is the detail nobody wants to believe when I tell this. People expect a monster to announce itself, to give some warning before it reaches into a lighted camp and lifts a grown man out of his chair like he weighs nothing at all. They want thunder. They want a scream that peels the paint off the sky. What we got was worse. What we got was silence. One moment Robert Wilson was sitting an arm's length from me, close enough that I could smell the instant coffee on his breath and hear the small wet sound he made chewing the inside of his cheek. He was 47 years old and built like a man who had spent his whole life carrying things that were too heavy for one person. He was in the middle of a sentence, and then the sentence simply stopped, the way a record stops when the needle is lifted off it, and the folding chair where he had been was rocking back on its hind legs in the firelight. Empty, and one of his boots lay on its side in the pine needles with the laces still tied in a double knot. There had been no sound. No branch broke. No breath moved the air. Nothing came out of the tree line, and nothing went back into it, or if it did so between two of my heartbeats, in the narrow place where a blink lives. I have carried a badge for the state of Maine for 19 years. I have pulled bodies out of the Bear River in the spring melt, and I have knelt beside hikers who broke their legs 8 miles from any road and held their hands while the helicopter fought the wind above Grafton Notch. I filed a report about what happened in those mountains above Bethel that autumn. The report is a lie. It is a careful, professional, well-organized lie, and every person who signed it knew it was a lie when they signed, and we did it anyway, because the truth does not fit inside the boxes on the form and because no one who has not stood where I stood would believe a single word of it. I am telling you the truth now. 9 of us went up into the high country that October. Not all of us came down. The ones who did will not say their names out loud anymore, will not look at a tree line at dusk, will not sleep with a window facing the woods. I am the only one left who is willing to remember those people the way they actually were. before that place took them apart, and I would rather you think I am a liar than let them vanish twice. So before I take you up the mountain, let me ask you for one small thing. If you feel the cold coming off this story already, if some animal part of the back of your neck is starting to pay attention, then subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell, because the files only get worse from here. And I would hate for you to miss the ones I have not found the courage to tell yet. That is all. Now let me tell you how it started. It started with a family named Harrow. They were from Massachusetts, a father and his 2 grown children, and they came up to hike the Mahoosuk Range the second week of October, when the birches were the color of struck matches and the tourists had mostly gone home. Experienced people, good boots, real maps, a personal locator beacon clipped to the father's pack. The kind of people who do everything right and disappear anyway. Their beacon fired once, at 3 in the morning on the 4th night, from a slope high above the notch where no trail goes, a place a careful hiker would have no reason to be. Then it went silent. It did not move again. When we triangulated the last position, it sat in a fold of the mountain so steep and so choked with blowdown that it took my search team 2 days to reach it, and when we got there, we found the beacon lying in the moss with the strap sheared clean through, and we found the father's pack, and we found a single trekking pole snapped in the middle, and we found no Harrows at all. That is where I met the rest of them. The search had drawn people from 3 counties. Some were mine, part of the volunteer search unit I run out of the station. Some were locals who knew the ground. There was Emily Johnson, 38, who had worked more searches with me than anyone else, and who could read a slope of scree the way other people read a page. There was James Smith, 34, young and sharp and certain, the kind of man who had an answer for everything and no patience for anything he could not put in a spreadsheet. There was Michael Williams, 45, a houndsman from over near Rangeley who had brought 2 of the best tracking dogs I have ever seen. There was Jessica Garcia, 41, a paramedic who had left a hospital job in Portland to come live where she could see the stars, and who had a way of making a frightened person feel like the most important human being on the earth. There was Amanda Clark, 36, quiet and strong, a trail crew veteran who could carry a load that would put me on my knees. There was Ashley Martinez, 47, a fire warden who had spent 9 summers alone in a lookout tower on the next ridge over and who knew the shape of that high country better than most people know the back roads of their own hometown. And there was Robert Wilson, whose boot I have already told you about. And there was the old man. William Rodriguez was 63 that autumn, though he looked older, the way men look older when the weather has been working on them for a long time. He had trapped and guided in those mountains since before I was born. And when the search coordinator asked if anyone knew the country above the notch, everyone in the room turned to look at William, because everyone already knew the answer. He did not want to go. I want you to understand that. When they said the last position was on the north slope above the old logging cut, something went out of his face, some warmth, and he sat very still for a moment. And then he said a thing I did not understand at the time. He said, "Not up there. We do not search up there. We wait for them to come down." Somebody laughed. A nervous little sound. Somebody said the Harrows might be hurt, might be dying, that every hour mattered. And it did matter. That is the terrible part. Everything we did for the right reasons. William stood up slowly, like a man whose knees were arguing with him, and he looked around the room at all our young certain faces, and he said, "If you are going up, then you listen to me and you do exactly what I say, and maybe some of you come back. It hunts what runs. It keeps what stands still. If it comes for you, you plant your feet and you put your eyes on the ground and you do not move, no matter what it does, no matter what it sounds like, no matter whose voice it borrows. The ones who run, it takes running. The ones who stand, it lets go." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when a sober man says something that sounds insane. James Smith, who could not help himself, asked what it was, and William Rodriguez looked at him with an expression I have never been able to forget. An expression that had grief in it, and pity, and something that might have been apology, and he said, "The thing that owns those woods, it was here before the trail. It was here before the town. It lets us walk around down low because down low does not matter to it. But that slope is its house, and you do not walk into a thing's house and start calling out the names of the people it has already taken." Nobody said anything for a while. We went up anyway. Of course we went up. There were people missing, and we had ropes and radios and rifles and dogs and each other, and we were the ones who came when the mountain took someone, and it never once occurred to any of us that this time the mountain might not give them back and might want more. We started up the north slope in a cold blue dawn with the frost still white on the ferns, 9 of us in a line, and the woods were so quiet that I could hear my own blood, and I told myself it was only the quiet of a place where nothing lives high up in the cold, and I was wrong. I was so wrong, because a place is never quiet like that unless something in it is listening. The first thing that was wrong was the smell. We had been climbing for maybe 3 hours, up through the spruce and the granite, following the fold in the mountain toward the last beacon position. When Michael's dogs stopped, they did not bark, they did not point. Michael Williams had run those dogs on grizzly sign up in Alaska and on cold murder trails for the county, and I had watched them work all morning with their noses down and their tails going like metronomes. Now they stopped in the trail with their tails clamped flat to their bellies and their hackles standing straight up in a ridge from their skulls to their hips, and they made a sound I had never heard a dog make. A thin, high keening, and they backed into Michael's legs and would not go forward. Then the smell reached the rest of us. I do not have the words for it, and I have been trying to find them for a long time. People say a bad smell, and they mean a dead thing. Roadkill in July, a deer that fell in a culvert. This was that, underneath, the deep sweet rot of meat that has been meat for a while. But over the top of it there was something else. Something that came up the back of the throat and sat there, an ammonia stink like a cage that has never been cleaned, and under that a musk so thick and so animal and so wrong that my body reacted before my mind did. My eyes watered. My stomach turned over. Every hair I had stood up the way the dog's hackles had, and I understood in some old buried part of me that does not use words that I was smelling a predator, and that the predator was very large, and that it was not far away. "Bear," said James Smith, but his voice did not have its usual certainty in it. "Big male, denning up early." William Rodriguez did not even look at him. He was staring up the slope into the black spruce where the smell was coming from, and his knuckles were white on the strap of his pack, and he said, very quietly, "Look at the trees." We looked at the trees. At first I did not see it, and then I could not stop seeing it. Something had taken the young saplings along both sides of the game trail and twisted them. Not broken, twisted, the trunks of trees as thick as my wrist wrung around like a dish rag. The green wood split in long white splinters and then bent down and woven together over the trail so that we would have had to duck to pass under them. There were dozens. They went up the slope ahead of us as far as I could see, an archway of tortured living wood, and the height of the arch told me something my mind did not want to know. Because whatever had reached up to bend those trees down had reached up higher than any of us could reach, standing on each other's shoulders. Amanda Clark, who had built trail in that range for 11 years and had never once been afraid of the woods, said in a small voice, "What does that? What in God's name does that to a tree?" Nobody answered her. Jessica Garcia had gone the color of ash. Emily Johnson had her hand on my arm, and I could feel it trembling, and Emily's hands did not tremble. We should have turned around right there. I have played that moment back 10,000 times. We had done our job. We had reached the last position and found the beacon, and we could have carried the evidence back down and let it be somebody else's problem. But there were 3 people missing, and one of them might have been alive somewhere past that archway. And Jessica said, "If they crawled up here hurt, we cannot just leave them." And she was right, and being right killed her. We went on. Under the arch. I felt each twisted trunk pass over my head, and I did not look up at them, because I did not want to see how high they went. Past the arch, the ground changed. There were footprints. They were pressed into a patch of black wet earth beside a seep where a little water came out of the mountain, and they were the size of a snowshoe, longer than my forearm, and they had 5 toes, and the toes had gripped the mud and dragged it back in little furrows the way your bare toes do on a wet dock. And the depth of them in that hard ground told Michael Williams something he did not want to say out loud. He crouched over them for a long time. He put his own big hand flat inside one, and his fingers did not reach the edges. Then he stood up and he looked at me and he said, "Whatever made these goes 600 pounds, maybe more, and it walks on 2 legs. Bears do not do this. Nothing does this." That was when the first knock came. It came from up the slope, from inside the spruce, a single hard crack of wood on wood, so loud and so deliberate that it echoed off the granite. The sound a man makes when he swings a baseball bat as hard as he can into the trunk of a tree. We all spun toward it, and out of the silence on the other side of us, from down the slope, from the way we had come, an answer came. Another crack, wood on wood, the same, but from the opposite direction. 2 of them, at least 2, and they were talking to each other, and we were standing in the middle. The dogs broke. Michael grabbed for their leads, but they were gone, tearing back down the slope toward the archway. And one of them made it, and one of them did not, and I do not want to tell you what the second sound was, the short, wet crunch and the yelp that stopped in the middle, but I heard it, and Michael heard it, and Michael Williams, who was the toughest man I knew, put both hands over his mouth and sank down onto his knees in the mud. We had one dog left, cowering. We had rifles that suddenly felt like toys. We had a paramedic who had gone silent, and a young man who no longer had any answers, and an old man who was not surprised by any of this, which was somehow the worst thing of all. And we had the smell, closer now, and the fading gray light, because we had spent too long climbing, and the sun was already dropping behind Old Speck. And William Rodriguez looked at the sky and said the words that ended us. We are not getting off this slope before nightfall. We have to make a stand and wait for morning. And I need every one of you to listen to me now like your life depends on it, because it does. We built the fire big. That was William's idea, and it was the right idea, or it should have been. We found a place where the granite came up out of the mountain in a low shelf, so that our backs were to the stone and nothing could come at us from behind. And we built the fire out in front of the shelf, and we fed it everything we could break. And the flames went up higher than a man, and the light of them pushed the spruce back into a wall of shifting shadow. William walked the edge of the firelight while there was still enough day to see, and he showed us. He picked up a handful of the crushed ferns where something had lain in the night, watching an earlier camp, the Harrows camp maybe. And he showed us how the thing had folded itself down small and still, how patient it had been. And then he made us repeat the rule back to him, one by one, like school children, until he was satisfied we had it. It hunts what runs. It keeps what stands still. When it comes, he said, and he said when, not if, it is going to try to make you run. It is not stupid, God help us, it is anything but stupid. It will circle. It will throw stones to break your nerve. And it can make sounds. It can make any sound it has ever heard. If you hear one of us screaming out there in the black, you do not go, because it will not be us. If you hear a child crying, if you hear your own name in a voice you love, you plant your feet and you look at the ground and you do not move. That is the only thing that has ever worked. That is the only reason I am an old man. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I know how this sounds, and I know some of you are certain you would have run, or shot, or done something other than stand in the black and let a thing come close. Maybe you are right. I hope you never find out. But if this story has its hand around your throat right now, then do me one small kindness in return, and leave a comment telling me the name of the town you are listening from and what time it is where you are sitting, because I like to know where in the world these files are landing, and because a comment keeps this channel alive so I can keep telling you the things I should probably keep to myself. Tap the like if the back of your neck has not stopped listening. Then come back to the fire with me, because full night has fallen now, and it is time. The knocks started again at full nightfall. They came from all around us this time. From up the slope and down it and from both flanks, a slow, patient conversation of wood on wood that moved through the trees and never came from the same place twice. We sat with our backs to the stone and our faces to the fire and our rifles across our knees, 9 of us, and we did not talk. And the fire ate itself lower no matter how much we fed it, because we were running out of things to break. Around what I think was midnight, the stones began. The first one came out of the black and struck the granite over our heads and cracked in half and fell into the fire and threw up a fountain of sparks, and it was the size of a man's fist, and it had been thrown so hard from so far out in the trees that no human arm could have done it. Then another, and another, landing all around us, never quite hitting us, and I understood that this was the point. It was not trying to hit us. It was trying to make one of us stand up and run. It was knocking on the walls of the box it had put us in to see which one of us would break first. None of us broke. God, I was so proud of us. Amanda was crying without a sound, the tears just running down her face in the firelight. And Jessica had both hands locked around Amanda's, and Emily was beside me with her shoulder against mine, and even James Smith had stopped looking for answers and was just breathing in and out, staring at the flames the way William had told us to. Robert Wilson was on my other side. He had a thermos of coffee, and somewhere in the middle of that endless night he had unscrewed the cap and poured himself a cup with hands that were steadier than mine. And he leaned over to me and he started to say something, some small human thing. I think he was going to tell me about his daughter. He had a daughter in college. He had shown me her picture on the drive up. He was in the middle of the sentence, and I have already told you the rest. I have already told you about the empty chair rocking on its legs and the boot on its side with the laces still tied. There was no sound. It reached over the top of the granite shelf that was supposed to be at our backs, the shelf we thought was safe. It reached down from above us with an arm long enough to do it, and it took Robert out of the space between me and the fire without disturbing a single ember. And it was so fast and so silent that Robert never even finished the word he was saying. The word was she. That was when Amanda screamed and stood up. I grabbed for her. Emily grabbed for her. We both had a hand on her jacket, and it was not enough, because terror is stronger than we are. And Amanda Clark tore out of our hands and out of the firelight, and ran into the black spruce, screaming Robert's name. And William was roaring at her to stand still, and she did not. She could not. And the sound she made going into the trees is a sound I hear in the worst hours of the night, because it went from a scream into something else, something high and surprised and then abruptly gone. And after that the woods were quiet again, and the stones stopped, and the knocks stopped, and we sat in a silence so total that I could hear the fire and my own heart, and Jessica Garcia praying under her breath in Spanish, over and over, the same 3 words. 2 of us gone, in the space of a minute. And the night was only half over, and out in the black, from the place where Amanda had vanished, a voice came drifting back to us through the trees. It was Amanda's voice. It was calling for help. It said, "Please, please, I am hurt. Please come, I cannot walk." It was perfect. Every note of it was hers. But Amanda Clark had gone into those trees 11 seconds ago, and no one gets hurt and calm and able to form a careful sentence in 11 seconds. And I looked at William Rodriguez across the dying fire, and his face was wet and his jaw was locked, and he shook his head at me, one small motion, side to side, and he mouthed the words at me, not her. So we sat, and we listened to Amanda's voice beg us to come and save her, over and over, moving slowly around the edge of the firelight in the black, and not one of us moved, and it was the hardest and the most shameful and the most necessary thing I have ever done in my life. And it went on until the sky in the east finally began to go gray. Morning did not save us. I need you to know that, because in every story you have ever heard, the sun comes up and the monster goes away. That is not what happened. The sun came up and showed us how much trouble we were truly in. We were 7. Robert and Amanda were gone. The last dog had not survived the night either, though I did not see how. It simply was not there anymore, and its lead lay chewed through in the ashes at the edge of the fire. When there was finally enough light to see the ground, we got up on legs that did not want to hold us, and we tried to leave. We could not leave. I have thought about this more than anything else, and I still do not fully understand it, and William only understood it a little, and what he understood terrified him more than anything with teeth. The archway of twisted trees, the way we had come up, was gone. Not hidden, gone. We walked down the slope to where it had to be, where the seep was, where the footprints had been in the black mud, and the seep was there and the mud was there, but there was no archway and no trail beyond it, only more spruce, standing close and even and wrong, marching away downhill in every direction the same. James Smith had a compass and a map and 19 kinds of certainty, and he took a bearing and led us confidently south, down toward the notch, toward the road, and 40 minutes later we walked back into our own dead campfire from the uphill side. He did it again, more carefully, watching the compass the whole way, refusing to look up, and it took longer, but we came back to the fire again, from a different direction this time, and James Smith sat down in the ashes and put the map over his face and made a sound I will not describe. And that was when we understood it did not need the night. Ashley Martinez had been walking at the back of our little line on that second loop, the way she always did, checking behind us, watching our trail the way a fire warden watches a ridge, because that was who she was. When we straggled back into the dead camp and I turned to count heads the way I had made myself do all morning, there were only 6 of us where there should have been 7. Ashley was not there. There was no sound. There had been no cry, no snapped branch, no scuffle in the leaves behind me, and I had been listening. I swear to you I had been listening with every nerve I owned. She had been 10 feet behind me in bright noon daylight on open ground, and then she simply was not, the way Robert had not been, the way a word disappears when you stop saying it. We called her name until our voices gave out. We walked back along the loop looking for her. There was nothing to find. It had reached into a moving line of people in the full light of a October afternoon and lifted a grown woman out of the middle of us without one of us feeling the air move. And I think that was the moment the last of my belief that we were going to survive this quietly left my body, because a thing that can do that in daylight is not an animal that we had wandered too close to. It was a hunter that had already finished deciding, and it was simply taking its time, and it wanted us to know it. It was hurting us. That is the only word I have. Every direction that led away from that slope simply turned us back, the way a rancher turns cattle, patiently, invisibly, and it was doing it in broad daylight, and it was not even letting us see how. William said the old people who had been in that country before all of us had a word for the high slope, and the word did not translate, but the closest he could come was that it meant a place that is bigger on the inside, a place that keeps what it takes, and that once you have walked into the middle of it and it has decided it wants you, the outside does not connect to the inside the same way anymore. Michael Williams stood up around noon and said he was done. He said he was going to walk out of there if it took all day, that he was not going to sit and wait to be eaten like the others, that there was a logging road down the fall line and he was going to find it. William begged him to stay in the group, to keep his feet planted, to not go off alone. Michael Williams had lost his dogs, the dogs he had raised from pups, and he was past hearing anyone. He picked up his rifle and he walked down the fall line into the spruce, and he did not run, I will give him that. He walked, steady and stubborn and brave. We heard him for a while, his boots on the deadfall. Then we did not hear him. An hour later we heard him again. He was screaming. It came from a long way off, from downslope, exactly where a man walking out would be. And it was the sound of a person in the worst moment of his life. And Jessica Garcia was on her feet before any of us could stop her, because Jessica was a healer and every cell in her body was built to run toward a person who was hurting. Emily got both arms around her from behind. Emily Johnson was not a large woman, but she locked her arms around Jessica Garcia and put her mouth against Jessica's ear and said, "It is not him, it is not him, remember the rule, it is not him," and Jessica fought her, and then the screaming from downslope changed. It layered. It became two voices screaming at once, in perfect time, the same screams, and then three, and then it was Michael's voice and Amanda's voice and Robert's voice all screaming together in a chorus that no throat could make, and Jessica Garcia stopped fighting and sank down in Emily's arms and understood, and we all understood, that it was showing us. It was telling us it had them all the ones it had taken, and it could wear their voices whenever it wanted. And there was no scream it could not make, and no help we could ever run to that would be real. That was the moment James Smith broke, but not the way you would think. He did not run. He stood up very slowly, and his face had gone strange and smooth, and he set down his rifle, and he said, in a flat, calm voice that scared me more than any scream, "I want to see it. I have been telling everyone what it is not for 2 days. I want to see what it is." And he turned and walked to the edge of the firelight, to the wall of shadow, and he looked up into the black spruce where the smell was thickest, and he stood there, and he found it. I know he found it because of his face. I was watching his face and not the trees, and I am grateful for that every day of my life, because whatever James Smith saw looking back at him out of that spruce emptied him. Everything that was James, the certainty and the sharpness and the young man who had an answer for everything, ran out of his face like water out of a cracked cup, and what was left was not a person anymore. He did not scream, he did not run. He just stopped, the way a clock stops, and he stood there staring up into the trees with his mouth a little open, and he never said another word, not one, not that day, and not in the hospital, and not in all the years since. James Smith is alive. James Smith is in a facility near Augusta, and he sits by a window that does not face any trees, and he has not spoken a single word since the moment he looked up into that spruce and saw the thing that owns the mountain look back down at him. We had to pull him back to the fire by his arms. He came like a mannequin, and behind us, up in the trees where he had been looking, something very large shifted its weight, slow and unhurried and enormous, and a low sound came out of it, not a roar, never a roar, a deep, soft, chuckling grunt, satisfied, the sound a thing makes when it is in no hurry at all because everything it wants is already inside the box, and the box has no door. The second night came, and William Rodriguez told us the rest of the truth because there was no reason left to protect us from it. He told us he had been up on that slope once before, 40 years ago, as a young man with his own father and 2 other trappers. He told us they had gone up after a string of lost hunters, exactly like us, and that his father had made them all repeat the rule, exactly like this, and that on the second night the thing had come for them, and that his father and 1 other man had held their feet and looked at the ground, and the 3rd man had run, and only the 2 who stood still had come down off the mountain alive. He told us his father never trapped again, never went into the deep woods again, and died an old man who slept with every light in the house burning. And he told us the part he had not told us before, the part that made Jessica Garcia start to weep again in the failing light. He said it does not always take you when it takes you. Sometimes it lets you go. My father was let go. He walked off that mountain on his own 2 legs, but it comes back for the ones it lets go. Not right away. It knows where they are. It came to the edge of my father's land every autumn for 30 years, and it stood in the tree line at the bottom of the field where he could see it from the kitchen window, and it just stood there all night, and in the morning it was gone, and it did that every single year until the year he died. Letting you go is not the same as being free. It only means it has decided it can take you whenever it wants, and it likes knowing you are down there, waiting, jumping at every shadow at the bottom of your field for the rest of your life. Nobody said anything. The fire was very low. We had almost nothing left to burn. Jessica Garcia said, in a voice that had given up everything except love. Then I would rather it took me than lets me go like that. And William looked at her with those grieving eyes and said, I know, so would I. But you do not get to choose. The thing came for us that second night the way I imagine the tide comes for a sandcastle, without hurry and without malice and without any possibility of being stopped. It knocked, it threw stones, it walked Amanda's voice and Robert's voice and Michael's voice around the edge of the light, begging, weeping, calling our names in the voices of people we had loved and lost. And we sat with our backs to the stone and our feet planted and our eyes on the ground, and we did not move. And one by one the fire died, and one by one our nerves frayed and the black closed in. Jessica Garcia went first that night. She did not run. I want that on the record. I want it known. She kept the rule to the last. She was holding William's hand on one side and Emily's on the other, and she was praying, and the thing reached in from the black and did not take her by force. It took her by the voice. It used a voice I had not heard it used before, a small child's voice, a little girl, and it said one word. It said Mama. And Jessica Garcia made a sound like her heart had been torn in half, and William gripped her hand and hissed, Do not move. Do not move. It is not real. And Jessica said so quietly, My daughter died 4 years ago. That is her. That is her voice. I do not care if it is real. And she stood up and she walked into the black toward her dead child's voice with her arms already opening, and the black took her, and it was gentle. I have to believe it was gentle because she was not afraid at the end. She was smiling. God forgive me, in the last of the firelight I saw that she was smiling. That is how it does it. Do you understand now? It does not need to be stronger than us, though it is. It does not need to be faster than us, though it is. It only needs to know us. It listens for what we love and what we have lost and what we would give anything to hear one more time. And then it says it back to us in the black, and it lets our own hearts do the rest. William Rodriguez was 63 years old, and he had followed the rule for 40 years, and it had never once failed him, and I believe it never would have. And I believe he could have stood at that fire until the sun came up. But when Jessica walked smiling into the black, chasing the voice of her dead daughter, something in the old man broke that had held for 40 years. He surged up off the ground with a cry, an old man moving faster than his body should allow, reaching after her, reaching to pull her back. And for one step, one single step, William Rodriguez ran. That was all it needed. The rule that had kept him alive for 40 years was that simple and that absolute. It hunts what runs. He took one running step into the black after Jessica and the mountain closed around him without a sound, and the old man who had come down off that slope alive as a boy did not come down off it twice. And I lost the man who had done everything he could to save every one of us, in the space of a single step, because his heart was better than his fear. Then it was Emily Johnson and me, and the hollow shell of James Smith standing frozen a few feet away where we had propped him, staring up into nothing with his mouth a little open, exactly as he had stood since the moment he looked into the spruce. The mountain took no more notice of James than it would of a stump. Perhaps a man who had stopped moving that completely was no longer worth the taking. So when I tell you there were 2 of us left, I mean 2 who could still think and still choose and still feel the terror crawling under our skin. Emily and me. Back to the stone, feet planted, eyes on the ground, and no fire left at all. We stood in the black with our backs against the granite, and we did not move. And the thing that owns the mountain came and stood in front of us, close, so close that the smell of it was a physical weight pressing on my chest, so close that I could hear it breathing, a slow, vast, wet sound like a bellows the size of a house, so close that I could feel the heat coming off its body in the cold, and I kept my eyes on the ground the way William had taught me, and I looked at nothing but the pale gleam of frost on the moss between my own boots, and I prayed to a God I was not sure was listening that Emily would keep her eyes down too. I could not see it. I will never be able to tell you what it looked like, and I am glad, because James Smith saw it, and James Smith has not spoken in years, but I could feel it studying us. It leaned down. I heard the creak of it, the shift of something enormous folding closer, and its breath moved my hair, hot and rank, and it made that low, soft, chuckling grunt again, right above us, curious, patient, in no hurry, because we were already inside and there was no door. And then it began to speak. It spoke in Robert's voice first, the coffee and the daughter, saying my name, gentle, the way a friend says your name. Then Amanda's voice, then Jessica's. Then it found the voice it had been saving, and it used the little girl again, but not for me. It turned the child's voice toward Emily, and it said, Auntie, Auntie, help me. And Emily Johnson made a small sound beside me because Emily did not have children of her own, but she had a niece she loved more than her own life, and I felt Emily's whole body go rigid, and I reached out in the black without lifting my eyes, and I found her hand and I gripped it as hard as I have ever gripped anything, and I breathed, do not move, it is not her, please, please do not move. And Emily did not move. She stood. She kept the rule. I felt her hand crushing mine, and I felt her whole body shaking like a struck bell, and I heard her weeping without a sound, and the thing above us tried harder, the little girl's voice sobbing now, screaming, begging her auntie to come, saying it was scared, saying it was cold, saying please, please, please. And Emily Johnson stood in the black with her eyes on the ground and her feet planted, and she did not go. She was stronger than her fear. She was stronger than William. She was the strongest of all of us. The thing gave up on the girl. It went quiet. And in that quiet I thought, we have done it. We have kept the rule. It is going to let us go. And then it used a new voice. It used my voice. It stood over the two of us in the black, and it spoke in my voice, perfect, exactly mine. And it said, calm and clear and certain, right into Emily's ear, it said, Emily, it is safe now. It is gone. You can run. Run now. I am right behind you. Run. I could not stop it. I opened my mouth to tell her no, that it was not me, that the real me was still holding her hand, but in that instant it spoke again in my voice, louder, drowning me out, urgent, saying, run, Emily, run, go now. And I felt the terrible logic of it land in her, the voice of the one person still alive beside her telling her to save herself. And I gripped her hand and I tried to say, it is the thing, it is not me, but there were two of my voices in the black now, mine and its, both saying opposite things, and how was she to know? How could anyone know? And Emily Johnson made her choice the way any of us would have made it. She chose to trust the voice of her friend, and she let go of my hand and she ran. She got 4 steps. I stood against the stone with my eyes on the ground and my empty hand still open in the shape of her hand, and I listened to Emily Johnson run 4 steps into the black, and I listened to the mountain take her, and it was not gentle, and I will not tell you what it sounded like, and I did not move. I did not move. The thing had used my own voice to send my last friend to her death 4 feet from where I stood, and I kept my eyes on the frost between my boots, and I did not go to her, because going to her was exactly what it wanted, and I stood there and I let it happen. And that is the thing I have to carry. That is the report I could never file, that at the very end I saved myself by standing perfectly still while a monster wearing my voice murdered Emily Johnson an arm's length away in the black. Then it was quiet. I stood against that stone until the sky in the east went from black to charcoal, to the first sick gray of dawn, and the whole time I felt it out there in the trees, watching, patient, and when the light finally came up enough to see, the slope was empty. The archway of twisted trees was back where it had always been, the trail beyond it plain and open as if it had never been gone, as if the mountain had simply unlocked the door now that it had taken everything it wanted and decided what to do with the one thing it had left, because it let me go. I understand that now, the way William's father understood it. 2 of us came down off that mountain. I walked down on my own 2 legs, and I led James Smith by the hand the whole way, the way you lead a small child through a crowd, and he came without a word, because he had no words left, and he has not found one in the 6 years since. He is the only other living soul who was up there, and he will never tell it, so I am the one who has to. The search became a recovery, and the recovery found nothing. No bodies, ever, not one. And I sat in a room with serious people from the county and the state, and I signed a report that said a rock slide and hypothermia and a tragic wilderness accident, and every person in that room knew it was a lie, and we told it anyway, because the truth has no box on the form. That was 6 years ago. I do not live in Bethel anymore. I moved out to a little house with a field behind it, a good open field where I can see a long way, and I told myself the distance would help. It does not help, because every autumn, when the birches go the color of struck matches and the tourists go home, something comes and stands in the tree line at the bottom of my field in the deepest part of the night, and it does not come closer and it does not go away. It just stands there where I can see it from my kitchen window. a shape too tall against the trees, all night, every night, for the whole of October. And in the morning it is gone. It is telling me it knows where I am. It is telling me that standing still did not save me. It only taught the thing that I will always stand still, and letting me go was never mercy. It let me go the way you let go of something you are certain you can pick up again whenever you please. It is not finished with me. It is only waiting, and it does not mind waiting because it has all the time in the world and I have less of it every year. And one of these autumns I am going to look out that window and the shape is not going to be at the bottom of the field. That is the whole truth. That is what happened to James Smith and Emily Johnson and Michael Williams and Jessica Garcia and Amanda Clark and Ashley Martinez and Robert Wilson and William Rodriguez in the mountains above Bethel. And that is why I am the only one who will say their names. And now you know their names too, and I need you to remember them because I do not know how many more autumns I have left to remember them for you. If you made it all the way to the bottom of this with me, then you are the kind of person these files are for. And I am asking you now, plainly. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell, so that if I stop posting 1 October you will at least wonder why. Leave a comment and tell me you were here, because every comment is a small light at the bottom of the field. Tap the like, share this with the one person you know who will not sleep tonight. And because I do not know how long any channel lasts, follow my backup channels as well, so you can always find me. They are called Sir Bellicchio, and Mr. Bellicchio, and Mr. Geronimo. Save all three. If this one ever goes quiet, you will know where to look for me. And if you live near the woods, do me one last favor. Tonight, before you sleep, look out at your tree line, just once. And if there is a shape in it that is too tall, do not run. The thing at the edge of the trees had learned to cry like a child. That is the part one never wrote in the report. The part one left off the page because there was no box on the form for it. There were no children on that ridge. There were no children within 140 miles of the place where I sat with my spine pressed to a spruce and my rifle laid flat across my knees, listening to something small and frightened weep in the black beyond the reach of my headlamp. I knew there was nothing small out there. I had knelt over the tracks that same morning, had laid my whole open hand inside one of them with room left over on every side. Whatever made that crying sound was not small at all. It only wanted me to think it was, so that I would stand up and call out and walk toward it in the kindness that lives in every person who has ever heard a child cry alone in the cold. I did not stand up. That is the only reason I am able to speak these words into a microphone tonight, in a warm room, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, hoping that distance is a real thing and not a story we tell ourselves. I wore the flat-brimmed hat and the green for 19 seasons. Most of those years were spent out of the station at Talkeetna, a small town at the end of a spur road in the interior of Alaska. The kind of place where the pavement simply stops and the forest begins and does not end again for the better part of a week if you walk it. People came to Talkeetna to fly onto the mountain, to fish the 3 rivers that braid together below the town, to vanish into the backcountry for a season and come out changed, or thinner, or not at all. My work was the not at all. When a party did not check in, when a plane radioed down a splash of orange fabric in a place no one should be, when a wife called the station at 2 in the morning because her husband had promised to be home by dark and dark had come and gone, they sent me. I was the one who went into the trees to bring people out. For most of those 19 years I told myself that was all the trees were. Trees. Before I tell you what changed my mind, I want to ask one small thing of you, and I will only ask it this once so that it does not interrupt the story. If you feel the cold of this place settle into you the way it settled into me, follow the channel and turn the notifications on so the forest can find you again next time. That single quiet tap is the whole reason I am able to keep telling these true accounts of the things that live past the last road. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the season it all came apart. It began with a man named Kevin Walker, 48 years old, out of Anchorage, an experienced hunter who had drawn a moose tag for a unit north of the Petersville country. He flew in with a bush pilot named Eric Wright, a lean and careful man of 41 who had put more small planes down on more gravel bars than anyone else working out of the strip that year. Eric dropped Kevin at a lake on a Tuesday in the second week of September and arranged to return for him 9 days later. That was ordinary. Men went in alone all the time. Kevin Walker had done it a dozen times before. He carried a rifle, a satellite messenger, a week and a half of food, and the calm confidence of a person who has never once been afraid in the woods and therefore does not know yet that fear is a tool, the same as a knife or a compass, and that a man who has lost it is already lost. On the fourth day, his messenger sent an automated check-in. All is well. He was allowed 3 canned messages on the device, and that was the one he chose. On the 5th day, nothing. On the 6th day, nothing. That in itself did not alarm anyone. The units up there swallow the sky. Ridges block the satellites. Batteries die in the cold. Men forget. But on the 7th day, the device sent its final transmission, and it was not one of the 3 prepared messages. Kevin Walker had typed a custom line, letter by letter, on a tiny screen with numb fingers, in whatever moment he had. The line read, "It keeps using my sister's voice." His sister was Melissa King, 54, and she was at home in Wasilla the entire time. She had not spoken to Kevin since he flew in. She had certainly not been in the woods calling his name. Eric Wright flew the lake on the 9th day as promised. Kevin was not there. His camp was there. The tent was up and zipped. His sleeping bag was inside, laid out neat. His rifle was leaned against a tree 20 feet from the tent, unfired, the safety on, a live round in the chamber. His boots were gone, his pack was gone, and around the whole camp, pressed into the black mud at the lake edge in a wide and patient ring, were tracks the length of my forearm, 5 toes, a deep heel, a stride so long that when I later tried to match it I had to break into a run. That is where I came in. Eric radioed it down, and by evening I was standing at that lake with a rain of gray light coming through the spruce and a feeling on the back of my neck that I have never been able to name and have never once felt in town. The feeling that the woods themselves had turned their attention on me. That I was not alone in the sense that a room is not alone, and also alone in the sense that no help was coming, and both of those things were true at once and would remain true for a long time. I want to describe the tracks for you the way I described them to no one, because the report only had room for length and depth and stride, and it did not have room for the truth of them. They were not the tracks of a bear. I have followed 10,000 bear. A bear rolls its weight and drags its claws and leaves a mess of a thing behind it, an animal walking like an animal. These were the tracks of something that walked the way you and I walk. Heel, then the ball of the foot, then a push off the toes, a deliberate and upright and thinking gait. There was a mind in those tracks. And the tracks did not blunder through the camp. They circled it. They came close to the tent and then withdrew, came close and withdrew. Over and over, all night by the count of the overlaps, the way a man will pace outside a door when he cannot decide whether to knock, or the way a thing will pace when it is waiting for the person inside to make the mistake of opening the door on their own. The old-timers in Talkeetna had a name for it, though they did not say the name out loud in the lodge, and they did not say it in front of me for the longest time because I was town enough to laugh, and they did not want to be laughed at, and they did not want to be right in front of someone who would only remember it later when it was too late to matter. There was a retired ranger named Joshua Lewis, 59, a man who had spent 40 years in that country before he handed me his hat, so to speak, and who had gone gray and quiet in a way I did not understand until that autumn. Joshua came to the station the day after the Walker camp. He did not knock. He let himself in and sat across the desk from me and looked at the photographs I had taken of the tracks, and he did not say anything for a long time, and then he said, "You laid your hand in one, did you?" I said that I had. He said, "Next time keep your hands to yourself. It does not like to be measured. It likes to do the measuring." And then he told me the only thing he ever taught me that turned out to matter more than a compass or a map or 19 years of training, and I am going to give it to you now the way he gave it to me, because you may need it more than you know. He said, "Out there the trees will call your name, in a voice you love, a voice you would run barefoot through the snow to reach, your wife, your child, a partner you buried. It is not them. It is never them, and here is the rule, and there is only the one rule, so learn it. Do not answer. Not a word, not a sound. Do not even let it hear you breathe if you can help it, because the moment you answer, you have told it that you are listening, and a thing that knows you are listening will never ever stop talking. It will follow that thread of your attention across 100 miles of country. It will talk to you in your tent, and it will talk to you in your truck, and one night it will talk to you in your own house in town with the lights on. And by then it will be too late, because by then it will not be outside anymore. It will be in your head. Do not answer. That is all. That is everything." I wrote none of that in the report. I filed Kevin Walker as a missing person, presumed a fall or a drowning, likely predation on the remains, cause undetermined. And I told myself, driving back to town under a sky going green with the first hard cold of the season, That Joshua Lewis was an old man who had spent too many winters alone in the black, and that I was a professional, and that the woods were only trees. I believed it for 11 more days. The second call came on a Thursday, and it was worse, because this time there were witnesses, and a witness is a terrible thing when the thing you are witnessing does not fit inside anything you have ever been allowed to believe. A group of 4 had gone up the Kasugi Ridge Trail, a long, high route that runs above the tree line with the whole face of the mountain on one side and the drop into the Susitna Valley on the other. They were not fools. They were fit and equipped, and one of them, Michelle Robinson, 43, had actually worked a season for the service herself years back and knew the country. They planned 3 nights on the ridge. On the second night, something came up out of the tree line below them, and it did not come the way an animal comes. I have Michelle Robinson's account because I took it myself, in the station, with a cup of coffee she never touched going cold between her hands, and because she came out of those woods a different person than the one who went in, and she wanted someone to write it down. She told me they had camped just at the edge of the Krumholz, the belt of stunted, twisted spruce where the forest gives up and the tundra begins. Around 1 in the morning she woke to the sound of her own name being called from below the camp, down in the trees. She said it was her brother's voice. Her brother had died in a car accident 9 years before. She said she knew that. She said she lay in her bag and she knew, with the front of her mind, that her brother was 9 years dead and could not be standing in a spruce thicket in the interior of Alaska calling her to come down. And she said the back of her mind did not care what the front of her mind knew. The back of her mind was already sitting up, already reaching for her boots, because it was his voice. It was exactly his voice, not an imitation, not close. It was him, the little break he always put on the second syllable of her name, the way he used to call up the stairs when they were children. And every part of her that had loved that voice for the first 34 years of her life was answering it before her thinking mind could clamp its hand over her mouth. She did not answer. This is the only reason I was taking her statement instead of filing her name next to Kevin Walker's. She bit down on her own hand until it bled, and she did not answer, and she woke the others by shaking them, one finger over her lips, and the 4 of them sat in the black in a tight knot and listened to the voice go from love to something else. Because when she did not come, it changed. It called again, and this time it was another voice, one of the men's mothers, and when that did not work it was a woman screaming for help, a real scream, the kind that puts you on your feet whether you want to stand or not, and when that did not work it began to run through them. All the voices, faster and faster, a child, a man begging, a woman laughing, her dead brother again, over and over, and Michelle said the worst part, the part she could not get past, was that in between the voices, when it thought they were not listening, she could hear it breathing, and the breath did not match the voices. The voices were human, the breath was enormous. The breath was the breath of something the size of the spruce it stood behind, drawing air slow and deep and wet, and then folding that breath into the shape of a child crying, the way you or I might whistle a tune, and pushing it back out at them across the black. They lasted until the light. When the sky finally grayed enough to see, the voices stopped, all at once, the way a radio stops when you pull the cord. And in the mud at the very edge of their camp, no more than an arm's length from where they had been sitting, close enough that it could have reached in and taken any one of them at any moment of that endless night, and had simply chosen not to, was a single track, facing in, toes toward them. It had stood at the door all night, and it had not come in. And the not coming in was somehow the most frightening thing of all, because it meant the thing had wanted something more than their bodies. It had wanted them to walk out to it, on their own. In answer, 3 of the 4 made it down. The 4th, a man, had stared into the trees so long during the night that something in him came loose, and on the way down the ridge in the daylight, on a wide safe stretch of trail with the whole valley open below them, he stopped, and cocked his head, and said, "Do you hear that? My daughter is down there." And before any of them could catch hold of him, he stepped off the trail and went down into the tree line at a dead run, following a voice only he could hear. Michelle went after him 20 feet and then she stopped, because she understood, standing there at the edge of the timber, that if she went in she would begin to hear it too, and once she began to hear it she would not come back out. They never found him. I logged him as a fall with the others. The valley took the truth and kept it, the way it keeps everything. I want to stop here for a moment and speak to you directly, because if you have listened this far then you and I are in this together now, and there is something I have learned that I did not know when I was young and safe. If any part of this is reaching you, if the hair on your arms has lifted even once, Do me the small kindness of leaving a comment below with the name of the town you are listening from and what the sky looks like outside your window right now. I read them, all of them. It helps me to know where you are, out there in the warm and the light, so that I can picture you safe while I tell you about the ones who were not. And if the story has its hand on the back of your neck, press the like because it helps these accounts reach the next person who needs to hear the one rule before they go into the woods without knowing it. That is all. We can go on now. By the end of that week, I had 2 files that did not fit, 3 dead or missing, a witness with a bandage on her hand who would not sleep with the light off, and a growing hollow feeling that the thing was not moving away from Talkeetna the way animals move, following the caribou or the salmon. It was moving toward the town. Every incident was closer than the last. The Walker camp was 50 air miles out. The Kisugi group was 20. And when Angela Young called the station on a Sunday morning and told me, in the flat, calm voice of a woman who had lived 66 years in that country and buried most of the people who had ever loved her, that something had been standing in the trees behind her house for 3 nights, breathing, and that on the 3rd night it had called to her in her late husband's voice, I understood that the 50 miles had become 50 feet. It was at the edge of town, and Angela Young, who knew more about the old things than any person alive in that valley, was the one who was going to teach me what Joshua Lewis had only warned me about. She was going to tell me what it wanted. What you have heard so far was not the worst of it. I need you to understand that, going in. What Angela Young told me in her kitchen, and what happened the night I finally went out to the tree line myself, is worse. But I am telling it in order, because the order is the only thing I have left that makes sense. And I am not ready yet to let go of the last thing that makes sense. Angela Young lived at the north edge of Talkeetna in a low house her husband had built, with a wood stove and a wall of windows that looked out into the black wall of the boreal forest, spruce and birch packed so tight that at 20 feet the trees became a single, unbroken darkness that no light of mine ever fully entered. She made me tea I did not drink, and she sat me down and she did not waste my time with whether I believed her. She had lived too long to care what a person from town believed. She only cared whether I would listen, and whether I would learn the rule in time. She told me the thing had many names and that she would not give me the one her own people used because names have weight, and to say the true name of a thing is a way of turning toward it, and you never turn toward it. She said her grandmother had known it, and her grandmother's grandmother, back and back, before any road, before any strip, before any plane, when the only lights in that whole country were the small red eyes of the fires and the great cold ribbons of the aurora overhead. She said the tall ones had always been in the deep country, up the drainages, over the passes, in the places the people knew to leave alone. She said there had always been rules for sharing a country with them. You did not follow a voice into the trees. You did not answer when the woods spoke. You left the deep drainages to them and you kept to the rivers, and you did not, ever, go looking for them. Because a person who goes looking for a tall one has already offered themselves, and the tall ones do not refuse an offering. I asked her why it was coming toward the town. Why now? She was quiet for a long time. The wood stove ticked. Out in the trees, though it was mid-morning and the sun was up, I could not shake the sense that the black spaces between the trunks were watching the two of us the way a face watches through a keyhole. And then she said the thing I have carried every day since. She said, "It is not coming toward the town. It is coming toward you." I did not understand. She explained it the way you would explain something to a child who has hurt themselves doing a thing they were told not to do. She said, "You put your hand in its track, you measured it, and then you went to every place it had been and you looked at what it left and you wrote it down and you carried its picture in your pocket and you thought about it, all day and all night, for 2 weeks. She said, you have been answering it this whole time, not with your voice, with your attention. You have been calling to it as loud as a person can call, in the only language it truly hunts by, which is the language of a mind turned fully toward it. Every man it has taken, it took because that man turned toward it. Kevin Walker measured it, and it followed the thread of his fear straight to his tent. The man on the ridge stared into the trees until the staring became a door and he walked through it. And you, she said, you have done nothing else for 14 days but turn toward it. She looked at me with her old flat eyes and she said, it is not stalking the town. It is stalking the one person in the town who will not stop thinking about it. It is stalking you, and it is close now. And the only thing you can do, the only thing, is to stop. Look away, close the file, put the pictures in the stove, go inside and lock the door and think about anything, anything at all, except the tall one, for as long as it takes for its attention to slip off of you and fasten onto something else, because attention is the thread, and as long as you hold the thread, it will hold the other end. I want to tell you I did what she said. I want to tell you I drove back to the station and burned the file and went home and thought about my truck, or the weather, or nothing. But I was a professional, and I had 3 people dead or gone, and there is a thing that lives inside people like me, a stubbornness that we mistake for courage, that will not let a thing alone that has hurt the people we were sworn to protect. I thought I could catch it. I thought that if I understood it, I could stop it, and that stopping it was worth the risk to myself. I thought the risk was to my body. I did not yet understand that the risk was to the thread, that the more I tried to catch it, the harder I turned toward it, and the harder I turned toward it, the tighter I pulled the other end into my own hands. So on a Wednesday night in late September, against the direct and specific warning of the 2 oldest and wisest people in that country, I drove to the end of the North Road, past Angela Young's dark and silent house, and I parked, and I walked in 100 yards to the edge of a black spruce muskeg, and I sat down with my back to a tree and my rifle across my knees, and I waited for the tall one to come and be caught. It came at 11:40 by my watch. I did not hear it approach. That is the thing no one tells you, and the thing you cannot understand until you have lived it. A creature that leaves a track the length of my forearm, that stands taller than the door of a house, that must weigh what a horse weighs, made no sound at all, coming through a muskeg that would have snapped and squelched under a fox. One moment the trees were empty. The next moment there was a shape in them, a deeper black in the black. Tall, far too tall, motionless, no more than 40 feet from where I sat. And it began to breathe, slow, deep, wet, enormous, exactly as Michelle Robinson had described, a sound that did not belong to any lungs I could imagine, drawing the cold air in and holding it and letting it out in a long, low pull that I felt in my chest more than heard. And then it called me by my name, in my mother's voice. My mother has been gone a long time. I will not tell you her voice, because it is mine, the last thing that is only mine. But I will tell you that it was her, not like her, her. Every warmth of her, every worn familiar turn of the single word of my name that she said 1,000 times across my childhood, coming out of a black shape in a spruce muskeg at 11:40 at night, in a voice that also, underneath, still carried the wet, enormous breath of the thing that was making it. And every cell in my body that had spent a lifetime loving that voice stood up and turned toward it and opened my mouth to answer. I did not answer. I want you to know how close it was. I had the breath in my throat. I had the word half formed. Mom. One word. And in the half second before it left me, I heard Joshua Lewis, plain as if he were sitting beside me, keep your hands to yourself, do not answer. And I clamped my own hand over my mouth so hard I split my lip against my teeth, and I tasted blood, and I did not make a sound. And the thing in the trees waited. And when I did not answer, it called again, my father this time. Then my mother again. Then a voice I did not want to place and placed anyway and will not name. And I sat there with my hand over my bleeding mouth for 4 hours while the thing that had learned every voice I had ever loved stood 40 feet away in the black and offered them to me one after another, patient as the cold, waiting for me to give it the one small sound it needed. And I did not give it, and I did not give it, and I did not give it. I need to break here because I have to tell you something before the last of it, and I may not get another good moment to say it. This channel is not my only one. I keep 2 others in case this one is ever taken from me, and I want you to know their names now so the thread between us is not so easily cut. If you ever come here and find me gone, look for Sar Bellico, and look for Mr. Bellico, and look for Mr. Geronimo. Go now, while you are thinking of it, and follow all 3, so that whatever happens, you and I do not lose each other in the black. That matters more to me than I can say. Now let me finish, because the sky is coming up gray in the last chapters. And gray light was the only mercy I was ever shown, and I am not sure it was a mercy at all. At the first gray of dawn the thing stopped, all at once, the way Michelle had said, like a cord pulled from the wall. The shape in the trees was simply gone. I had not seen it move. I sat there with a torn mouth and legs that had gone dead beneath me and a rifle I had never once raised, because somewhere in those 4 hours I had understood that raising it would have been the same as answering. It would have been turning toward. And I walked out of that muskeg in the gray light with the certain knowledge that Angela Young had been right about all of it, and that I had made everything worse because I had not looked away. I had gone and sat 40 feet from it and stared into it for 4 hours. I had pulled the thread as tight as a thread can be pulled. and whatever slender chance I had of it losing interest in me, I had spent. I stopped going into the woods after that. I want you to understand that I did the only right thing I had left to do, which was to stop. I closed the files. I put the photographs in the stove at the station and watched them curl and go to ash. I did not follow the next call that came in, and there was a next call. A hunting party out past Petersville, and I sent 2 younger men in my place, and I have not forgiven myself for that, and I am not asking you to forgive me either. One of those 2 men was Brian Allen, 35, a good ranger, steady, and he came back changed the way they all came back changed, quiet, watching the tree line. And 3 weeks later his wife found him standing in their yard at 2 in the morning in bare feet in the snow facing the black wall of the forest behind their house, and when she called to him he did not turn, and she said his lips were moving, and she got close enough to hear, and he was answering something, softly. Come and go answers, back and forth, a conversation, with the trees. She got him inside. He would not say who he was talking to. He left the service that winter and moved his family to Fairbanks, and I heard he does not sleep, and I heard he keeps every light in the house on, and I heard from a man who visited him that sometimes in the middle of a sentence Brian Allen will stop and cock his head and listen to nothing, and then go on. The thread had fastened onto him the night he went into the woods in my place, and I had sent him. I traded my thread for his. I have to live with that, and I do, every single day. I thought that would be the shape of the rest of my life. Guilt, and locked doors, and the sound of the wind in the spruce that I could no longer hear as only wind. But there was one more thing I had to do. One thread I could not leave hanging, and it took me all the way to the top of the world to do it. Because in the old files, the ones from before my time, the ones Joshua Lewis had kept in a box in his cabin for 40 years, there was one person who had heard the tall one call and had not answered, and had not gone into the trees, and had not come loose, and had lived and was still living. A woman named Christina Scott, 37 now, who as a young woman had been part of a survey crew far to the north, up on the tundra above Utqiagvik, the town most people still call Barrow, the northernmost town in the country, out on the edge of the frozen ocean where the sun goes down in November and does not come up again until January, and there is not a single tree for 400 miles in any direction. And the tall one had come for that crew, out there, on open ground, under the aurora, where there was nowhere to hide and nothing to hide behind, and it had called them one by one out onto the ice, and Christina Scott was the only one who did not go. She was the only living person who had heard it and beaten it and could tell me how. And I needed to know how. Not for me. I was already lost, I knew that. For Brian Allen. For whoever came next. I needed to know if there was a way to cut the thread once the thing had hold of it. So I flew north. It is a long way. You fly to Fairbanks, and then you fly again, small, over a country that empties out beneath you until there is nothing at all. No road, no tree, no light. Just the white curve of the earth going up to meet the polar night. And then at the very edge of the land, on a spit of gravel between the tundra and the ice, there is Utqiagvik. I want you to hold that place in your mind, because it is the opposite of Talkeetna in every way, and yet the tall one had been there too, and that told me the thing I most did not want to know, which is that it is not a creature of the deep forest at all. The forest is only where it is easy. It can cross open ground, it can cross the tundra, it can cross the ice. Trees are not what keeps it out. Nothing that grows out of the earth is what keeps it out. The only thing that has ever kept it out is the one rule, and the rule is the same at the top of the world as it is at the end of the spur road, and the rule is do not answer, and I had come 4,000 miles to a woman who had kept that rule to ask her the question I was most afraid to ask, which was whether keeping it was enough, whether the silence had actually saved her, or whether it had only made her wait longer for the same end. Christina Scott met me in a small warm room with the polar twilight pressing blue against the window, that strange endless dusk that is all Utqiagvik has of day for those months. And she looked at me the moment I came in and she said, "You have it on you. You have turned toward it. I can always tell." And I said that I had. And she said, "Then I am sorry, because I am going to tell you the truth, and the truth is not the thing you flew all this way to hear. I am going to give you what Christina Scott told me, in that blue-lit room at the top of the world, as close to word for word as I can, because it is the center of everything, and because if you have followed a voice this far, if you and I are truly in this together now, then you have earned the truth the same as I did, even though the truth is a weight and not a gift." She said that yes, on the tundra above Utqiagvik when she was young, the tall one had come for her survey crew. She said it came in the polar night, out of the endless blue black. when the sun had already gone for the season and the only light was the moon on the snow and the aurora burning cold and green overhead. She said there was no forest, no cover, nothing, just the flat white going on forever. And somehow that was worse, because in the forest at least you can tell yourself it is hiding in the trees, and out there on the open tundra there was nothing for it to hide behind, and it hid anyway. It was simply not there, and then it was there, a tall black nothing standing on the white 100 yards off under the aurora, and it began to call. Her crew was 6. Over 3 nights it called them out onto the ice one by one, in the voices they loved, and one by one 5 of them answered, and went, and did not come back. She described a man walking out across the snow in his socks toward the voice of his dead wife, calm, smiling, and how they could not stop him, how a person who is answered cannot be stopped, how it is like watching someone walk into the sea. And she said she was the 6th, and it called her in her mother's voice, the same as it called me. It is always the voice you would run barefoot through the snow to reach, and she did not answer. 3 nights, alone at the end, with the aurora overhead and the voices of everyone she had ever loved rising off the empty ice. And she bit down and she did not answer. And on the 3rd dawn a plane came, and she lived. And then she told me the truth I had flown 4,000 miles to avoid. She said, "The silence does not cut the thread. It only keeps it from tightening." She said, "Once it has turned toward you, it never fully turns away. Not ever." She said she had lived 17 years since that ice, and in all 17 years, not one has passed without a night, out of nowhere, when she wakes to the sound of her name and her mother's voice, coming from outside, coming from the dark beyond whatever wall she is sleeping behind, no matter where she is, no matter how far from any tree, no matter how many locks on the door. She said it found her in a city apartment in the south, 12 floors up. She said it found her in a hospital. She said it will find me, wherever I go, for the rest of my life, and that the only thing I can ever do, the only thing, the same thing, forever, is not answer. She said, "You do not beat it once. You beat it every night, for the rest of your life, and the night you lose everything, and you will not even feel it happen, because on that night it will not sound like a monster. It will sound like your mother, and you will be tired, and you will answer, and you will go." She said the reason she moved to Utqiagvik, to the very top of the world, to the edge of the ice, was not that the tall one could not reach her there. It could, it had, from the very start. She moved there because she had decided that if she was going to hear that voice every night for the rest of her life, she wanted to hear it in the one place on earth where the answer, if she ever gave it, would take her out onto 400 miles of open ice, where there was no chance at all of surviving the going, so that on the night she finally broke, the night she finally answered, it would be quick and it would be certain, and there would be no long, slow crawl toward it, through the trees, with time to feel every foot of the mistake. She had chosen a clean place to lose. That was the only choice any of them had. Not whether to lose, only where. I did not sleep on the flight home. I flew back down over the emptying and then filling country, tundra to forest, ice to spruce, and somewhere over the interior, with the black trees running out beneath me to every horizon, I understood that I was carrying the thread home with me, that it stretched all the way back to a black spruce muskeg at the end of the North Road, and that it would never let go, and that Christina Scott had told me the truth, and the truth was that the rest of my life was going to be a single sentence repeated every night in the voice I loved most, and my whole remaining task on this earth was to keep my mouth shut while my own heart begged me to open it. That was 6 years ago. I have kept my mouth shut for 6 years. 6 years of waking to my mother's voice outside the window. 6 years of the wet, enormous breath under the warmth of her word. 6 years of my hand pressed over my own mouth in the black, tasting old blood from a lip I split against my teeth on a night at the end of a spur road, holding the one word behind my teeth, not answering, not answering, not answering. I am telling you all of this tonight for a reason, and I have to tell you the reason now, because I am nearly out of story, and because you and I are the only 2 people in this, you out there in the warm and the light, and me in this locked room, and I do not want to face the end of it alone. So before the last of it, let me say it one more time, and let me mean it more than I have ever meant anything. Follow this channel, and follow the others, Sir Bellico and Mr. Bellico and Mr. Geronimo, and leave a comment tonight. Tell me where you are, and that you are safe, because I read them in the bad hours, and they are the thread that ties me to the living. And press the like so that the one rule reaches one more person before they walk into the trees not knowing it. Do that for me, and then stay with me for the end. It is short. I am almost done. I said I have kept my mouth shut for 6 years. That is true. I want to be honest with you all the way to the end, because you have stayed with me and you have earned honesty, and because a thing I have learned is that the truth is the last rule, the rule under all the other rules, and I have broken enough rules for one life. The voice has never stopped. I moved out of Alaska. I moved as far as a person can move and still be in this country. I live now in a warm, dry place with no forest for 100 miles, in a house on a street with lights, with neighbors, with a locked door and drawn curtains, exactly the kind of place where a thing out of the deep Alaska country could not possibly be. And every night, or nearly every night, sometime in the small hours, I wake to my name, spoken once, gently, from just outside the window, in my mother's voice. And underneath it, if I hold very still, I can hear the wet, enormous breath of the thing that learned her, folding the cold air into the shape of the word I have loved longest, and pushing it through the glass at me across 4,000 miles and 6 years and every wall I have ever put between us. It is not in the trees. It was never really in the trees. Angela Young told me at the start, and I did not understand her. It is on the thread, and the thread runs from it, wherever it truly is, straight to the one place it has hold of, which is the inside of my head. And there is no lock on that door. And there never was. Christina Scott told me, you do not beat it once, you beat it every night, and the night you lose everything. And it will not sound like a monster. It will sound like your mother, and you will be tired, and you will answer, and you will go. I have thought about that sentence every night for 6 years. And I want to tell you something about being tired. When you are young and safe, you think that not answering is a thing you do with your courage. It is not. Courage runs out. Everything runs out. Not answering is a thing you do with the last of yourself night after night, and there is a bottom to that well, and I have been closer to the bottom than I have ever told anyone, and I am telling you now, tonight, because tonight I need you to understand exactly what it is I am asking of you and exactly what it has cost. Here is the reason I made this recording. Here is the truth under the truth. 3 nights ago, I woke to the voice, the same as always, my name in my mother's voice from outside the window. But 3 nights ago, there was something new. Because 3 nights ago, underneath her voice, folded into the wet, enormous breath, there was a second voice learning to speak, younger, struggling with the shape of the words the way the tall one struggled at the start, all those years ago, before it learned my mother. And I lay there in the black with my hand over my mouth, and I listened to the second voice practice, and after a while I understood whose voice it was learning. It was learning mine. It has stood outside my window for 6 years, and it has listened to me breathe, and it has listened to me weep, and now it has enough of me to begin to build me, and soon, one night soon, it is going to call someone else, someone who loves me, in my voice, exactly my voice. The little break I put on the second syllable of the word they know me by, and that person is going to sit up in the black and turn toward it and open their mouth to answer. And I will not be there to clamp my hand over their mouth, and I will not be there to say the one rule. So I made this. This is the rule, given to as many of you as a voice can reach, so that when it comes for you, and it will, in my voice or another, in the voice you would run barefoot through the snow to reach, you will already know. Do not answer, not a word, not a breath. It is not them. It is never them. Hold the one word behind your teeth and do not give it, and do it again the next night and the next for the rest of your life, because that is the whole of the task. And the task does not end, it only waits. I have been telling you this for 6 chapters in a warm locked room, and I have told you it is a true account, and it is. But I have not been fully honest about one thing, and I promised you honesty to the end, so here it is, and then I am done. I am so tired. I have been so tired for so long. And a little while ago, before I began to speak to you, out there past the curtain, in the black beyond the glass, in my mother's voice, in the voice I have loved longest and would run barefoot through the snow to reach, gentle as it has ever been, closer than it has ever been, it said my name. And this time, my friends, this time, I am going to keep talking to you, because you are the thread that ties me to the warm and the light, and as long as I am talking to you, I am not answering it. So stay, please stay, follow the channel, and follow the others, Sr. Bellicho, and Mr. Bellicho, and Mr. Geronimo, and comment, and tell me where you are, and stay on the line with me through the small hours, because the moment you go, the room will be quiet, and in the quiet there is only the one voice, and I am so tired, and I do not know, tonight, for the first time in 6 years, I honestly do not know whether I am going to be able to keep my mouth shut. It is saying my name again. Do not answer when the woods call you. That is the one rule. I have kept it for 6 years. It is saying my name. Stay with me, please. It is saying my name, and it is my mother, and I am so tired, and the word is right here behind my teeth, and I can feel my mouth beginning to open, and I want you to remember, whatever you hear next, whatever comes through in whatever voice, that it is not me, it was never me, and you must not, you must never, you must not ans. The radio caught it first. Not words. A shape of sound where words should have been, low and wet, dragging itself out of the speaker like something climbing out of a well. Hannah Cooper would tell me later that she heard her own name inside that static 3 full seconds before the scream started, and that the worst part was not the scream. The worst part was that the voice calling her name sounded almost right. Almost like Frank. Almost like a man she had hiked beside for 6 days through the Alaska range. Close enough that she trusted the shape of his voice the way you trust the weight of your own boots. Almost is the word that ends people in that country. I found the radio 2 days later, wedged under a shelf of black spruce roots 400 yards from where the group had made their 4th camp. The battery casing cracked open like a jaw, the microphone still keyed. Whatever had been transmitting had held the button down for 11 minutes before the unit finally died. I have listened to that recording more times than I will ever admit to my supervisor, and I have never once made it past the 9th minute without shutting it off. This is the account of what happened to 8 people who walked into Denali National Park and Preserve in the 2nd week of September, and to the thing that walked out wearing pieces of what they used to be. Before we go further, if this is your first time sitting with one of these stories, I want you at these channels when the next one drops, because the accounts do not stop, and neither should you. Find me under the names Sir Belecho, Mr. Belecho, and Mr. Geronimo, and press that subscribe button now. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from, and give this one a like before the fear talks you out of it. Now, back into the trees. My uniform does not make me brave. It makes me the last name people say before they stop believing anyone is coming. I have worn the green and gray of the National Park Service for 11 seasons, most of them quiet, a few of them the kind that keep a person from ever fully sleeping again, and I can tell you that nothing prepares you for the particular silence of Denali in the last warm week before the snow locks the interior shut. The silence has a texture to it up there, thick and cold at the edges, and if you have spent enough nights alone in a patrol cabin listening to it, you start to understand that silence is not the absence of a listener. It is the sound a listener makes when it does not want you to know it is there. Gregory Rivera was 66 years old and had been leading backcountry parties through the range since before I was hired. A wiry, sun-cured man who moved through willow thickets like the plants owed him a debt. He held the permit for the group that week. 8 names on a single sheet of waterproof paper that I stamped myself at the backcountry desk on a Tuesday morning that smelled like coffee and diesel and the particular mineral cold that rolls down off the glaciers before autumn. Hannah Cooper, 36, a physical therapist from Bend who had done 3 of these trips with Gregory before and trusted him the way you trust a father. Frank Richardson, 58, retired from a career in structural engineering, the kind of man who checked every knot twice and still worried he had missed something. Martha Cox, 48, a school teacher who kept a small leather journal she filled with sketches of ptarmigan and dwarf birch. Zachary Howard, 30, the youngest of the group, an assistant guide Gregory was training to eventually take over these trips. Deborah Ward, 53, quiet, watchful, a woman who had lost her husband 2 winters before and told Gregory she needed a place big enough to hold the grief without it following her home. Scott Torres, 46, a contractor with a laugh that carried across a whole valley, and Pamela Peterson, 64, the oldest besides Gregory, a retired librarian with a memory for trail names and old stories that made her, in her own quiet way, the group historian. I checked their gear, I checked their route, and I checked, out of a habit I could not name, the tree line to the west, where the black spruce thinned into open tundra and the land began to fold itself upward into the foothills of the range. I had heard something out there 3 nights before, on a solo patrol, a call that started like a wolf and then bent itself into something with too many joints in it, a sound that rose and then dropped an octave in a way no canine throat should have been able to manage. I had written it in my log as unidentified vocalization, distance approximately 1 mile, direction northwest, because that is what the job requires of you. The job requires you to write down only what you can defend later. Gregory signed the permit, folded it into his breast pocket, and looked at me with the particular expression of a man who has heard the same rumor I had heard, many times, from many mouths, over many years. "There is an old rule," he said, "that the Athabascan families up around the Nanana corridor used to teach their children before anyone carried a rifle into these hills. If you are ever called by name out there in a voice that should not know your name, do not answer. Whatever it is, it can only follow you home if you give it your voice first." I told him that sounded like a fine rule for children and a strange rule for a man leading 8 adults into the backcountry for 9 days. He did not laugh. He said the rule works the same on grown men. Maybe better, because grown men have forgotten how to be afraid of the right things. I did not think of his words again until the 4th night, when the radio at the ranger station began picking up a transmission on the group's assigned frequency that was not, by any measure I could explain, a human voice using human intentions. The first 2 days of the trip logged clean. Gregory radioed in each evening at 1800 hours exactly, gave me a grid reference, a weather note, a head count, 8 confirmed, he would say, and I would write it down, and that was the whole of it. Routine as a held breath. On the 2nd night he mentioned they had crossed fresh tracks along a gravel bar near a braided stream, tracks he described as canine in general shape but wrong in the specifics, a stride too long for the print width, a rear paw that seemed to drag a 5th digit where there should have been 4. He said it with the flat, careful tone rangers use when they do not want to alarm a novice over the radio, but I heard the tightness underneath it, and I told him to keep the group tight and to keep noise discipline after dark. He laughed a little and said Zachary had already nicknamed the tracks the Dog Man, half a joke, the kind young guides make to feel less afraid of the size of the country around them. The 3rd night the transmission came in 11 minutes late and lasted only 40 seconds. Gregory's voice sounded thin, stretched over some distance that was not only geographic. He said the group had heard something calling from the ridge above their camp for close to 20 minutes after dusk, a sound he could only describe as almost a voice, almost forming words, almost saying Martha's name, though Martha herself had been sitting by the fire the whole time, hearing her own name called from a hillside she had never climbed. He said the group was fine. He said they would push south in the morning, away from the ridge, toward a lower basin with better sight lines. He said Deborah had not slept, and neither, if he was honest, had he. Then the transmission cut, not with static, but with a silence so total it sounded engineered, as if something had reached out and pressed its hand flat over the whole radio spectrum. I drove to the district office that night and requested a look at satellite weather imagery over their basin, hoping for some meteorological explanation, some inversion layer bending sound waves in a way that could account for a voice traveling further and stranger than it should. What I found instead was a cold front dropping in fast from the north, a full 11 degrees in 6 hours, arriving 2 days ahead of every forecast model, as if the country itself had decided the season needed to end early, needed the leaves down and the game moved off and the tourists gone, needed the deep interior sealed up quiet before whatever was walking through it finished its business. On the 4th night, the radio caught Hannah's scream and Frank Richardson's name spoken in a voice that was almost his own, and after that, for 6 days, nothing came through at all. We staged the search out of the Toklat contact station at first light. 4 of us from the permanent staff, 2 seasonal rangers, and a volunteer search team flown in from Fairbanks once the weather window allowed it. I led the ground element myself, because I had stamped that permit, because I had heard something in the willows 3 nights before anyone else had a reason to be afraid, and because a part of me, the part that still writes reports at 2 in the morning trying to make sense of things that refuse to make sense, needed to see the 4th camp with my own eyes before anyone else's account could shape what I expected to find. The camp was exactly where Gregory had radioed it would be. 3 tents pitched in a rough triangle on a bench above the braided stream, a fire ring gone cold, packs still lashed shut and leaning against a stunted spruce. Nothing had been ransacked. That detail unsettled the search coordinator more than any sign of struggle would have, because animals that raid a camp for food leave chaos behind them, torn nylon, scattered granola, the evidence of appetite. This camp looked abandoned mid-breath, as though every person in it had simply stood up at the same moment and walked into the trees without once looking back for their belongings. Frank Richardson's sleeping bag was unzipped and folded back with an almost domestic neatness, and beside it, pressed into the moss, was a single print that matched nothing in any field guide I have ever carried. Canine in the broad strokes, the way a wolf print is canine, but the toe spread was too wide, the claw marks too deep and too straight, driven into the earth at an angle that suggested the weight behind them had come down on 2 legs rather than 4. Martha Cox's journal lay open beside the print, and on the last completed page, in her own careful teacher's hand, she had written 3 words before the entry simply stopped. "It is answering." Zachary Howard's boots were gone from beside his tent, but his socks were still tucked inside them, side by side. Laces loosened the way a person removes footwear when they intend to walk quietly, deliberately, on bare feet across ground that would hurt anyone in their right mind to cross unshod. Deborah Ward we found first, half a mile up the drainage, sitting upright against a boulder with her eyes open and her hands folded in her lap as though she had simply grown tired and decided to rest. She was alive, which the search team treated as a miracle until we understood, over the following hours, exactly what kind of miracle it was. She did not speak for 11 hours. When she finally did, her first words were not about Frank or Martha or Zachary. Her first words were a question, delivered in a voice scraped thin from cold and disuse. She asked me whether I had heard her husband's voice on my drive up the valley, because she had heard it clearly the night before, calling to her from somewhere below the ridge, using a nickname only he had ever used, a nickname she had not spoken aloud to another living person in the 2 years since his funeral. I told her I had heard nothing. I did not tell her that a nickname known to no one else meant it could only have come from inside her own memory, extracted somehow and worn like a coat by whatever had been circling that camp in the days before. That kind of honesty would have served no one, least of all a woman who had somehow survived a night that had erased 3 of her companions. Gregory found us at the boulder an hour later, walking down out of the willows on his own power, which told me more about the man than any story he could have told with words. He was scratched along both forearms, his jacket torn at the shoulder seam, and he was carrying, clutched against his chest with both hands like a man carrying a lit fuse he dared not drop, a small brass whistle on a length of braided cord. He told me the whistle had belonged to his own mentor, a man named Harlan who had guided these same drainages for 30 years before Gregory ever set foot on them, and that Harlan had given it to him on his last trip out of the back country with a piece of advice that had sounded, at the time, like the kind of folklore old guides passed down mostly to keep young ones humble. Harlan had told him that a call from a person is never perfectly even. A human throat wavers, breaks, catches breath in the middle of a long note, because human lungs are not built for a single unbroken tone. But the thing that sometimes answers back from the hills, if it ever tries to imitate a whistle instead of a voice, cannot manage the waver. It holds the note too clean, too long, too perfect, the way a machine holds a tone rather than the way a chest does. Gregory said he had blown 3 short blasts on that whistle every hour through the worst of the night, a private signal only he and Harlan had ever used because he needed some sound in that basin that he could trust absolutely. A sound with no room in it for something else to hide inside. He said that just before dawn, from somewhere up on the ridge, something had answered him back. 3 short blasts. Perfect and clean and utterly wrong, because there was no second whistle out there in those hills, and there was no explanation for how 3 notes made of breath and brass could be reproduced by anything that did not have lips, lungs, and a length of borrowed metal. I have carried a great many strange reports out of that park in 11 seasons of this work. I had never before carried one home with me the way I carried that whistle story, turning it over in my mind on the long drive back to the station, wondering what kind of throat could learn to copy a sound that precisely, and why, of all the sounds in that basin to imitate, it had chosen the one thing Gregory trusted most. We reorganized the search on the 5th day with the understanding, spoken by no one directly but carried by every member of the team, that we were no longer only looking for lost hikers. We were looking for something that had learned to use their own voices against them, and that fact reshaped every decision we made from that point forward. Radio discipline tightened. No one called out a missing person's name into open terrain unless they had visual confirmation first, because Gregory's account had convinced even the most skeptical members of the team that a called name in that basin might summon an answer wearing the wrong face. Scott Torres and Pamela Peterson turned up together on the 5th afternoon, 3 miles north of the 4th camp, in a stand of black spruce so dense that our helicopter had passed directly overhead twice without spotting them. Scott had a fractured wrist and a laceration along his scalp that a physician's assistant back at the district clinic would later describe, with visible unease, as a wound pattern more consistent with a raking claw than any fall or collision. Pamela had no physical injuries at all, which should have been the good news of the day and instead became, once she started talking, the detail that kept the search coordinator awake that night. Pamela told us that on the 3rd night, before Frank and Zachary and Martha vanished, she had woken to the sound of something moving along the outside of her tent wall. Slow, deliberate, pausing every few feet the way a person pauses to read a sign. She had lain still, remembering an old story her own grandmother used to tell about weshuge, a hunger that wears a familiar shape to get close enough to feed, a story she had never mentioned to anyone on the trip because she had not wanted to be the frightened old woman filling young ears with superstition on their first backcountry expedition. She said the thing outside her tent had begun to hum, low and tuneless at first, and then, over the course of perhaps 10 minutes, the humming had resolved itself into something closer to a lullaby. A specific lullaby, one her own mother had sung to her as a child in a language Pamela herself had not spoken fluently in over 50 years. She said she understood, listening to that lullaby drift through thin nylon in a language English speakers should not have had any access to, that whatever was circling her tent was not guessing at what might comfort her. It was reaching directly into whatever was oldest and softest inside her, and pulling the softest thing back out to use as bait. She had not answered it. She had bitten down on the collar of her own jacket to keep from making a single sound, and she had thought, over and over, of Gregory's rule from the morning of departure. If it calls you by name, in a voice that should not have your name, do not answer. She had reasoned, lying rigid in the cold, that a lullaby in a dead grandmother's dialect was simply her name spoken a different way, and she had held her silence until the humming finally moved off into the trees sometime before dawn. Scott's account was rougher, delivered in fragments, because whatever had happened to him in those 3 intervening days had left gaps in his memory that our search coordinator's report would later describe only as periods of unaccounted time. What he did remember clearly was a moment on the second night when he had heard Deborah's late husband's voice, the exact nickname Deborah herself would later describe hearing, calling from somewhere below their position, and Scott, who had never met the man and had no way of knowing that nickname existed, had nearly walked toward it before Gregory's hand closed hard around his arm and pulled him back into the fire's circle of light. "It only knows what it takes from us," Gregory had told him that night, according to Scott's fragmented recollection. "Every voice it uses, it borrowed from somebody's memory first. It cannot invent a single sound of its own. That is the only mercy this country has left us, and it is a thin one." I wrote that line into my report exactly as Scott repeated it to me because it matched, almost word for word, something Pamela had said independently an hour earlier about the lullaby. And 2 survivors arriving at the same insight without comparing notes told me more about the shape of the threat than any physical evidence we had recovered from the abandoned camp. Pamela spent that evening at the clinic filling in more of her grandmother's old story for me, careful and unhurried, the way a librarian handles a fragile binding. She said the word weshug was never used casually by the families who carried it, and that her grandmother had always framed it less as a creature with a fixed body and more as a hunger that borrowed whatever body happened to be convenient at the time, a hunger that had once, generations back, belonged to a person who had gone too long alone in hard country and eaten something no person was ever meant to eat, and had never fully managed to become a person again afterward. She said her grandmother taught that the transformation was not the dangerous part. The dangerous part was the memory the hunger kept of having once been someone who loved and was loved, because that memory was exactly the instrument it used afterward to draw others close enough to feed. She told me that her grandmother's version of Gregory's rule went a step further than his did. It was not enough to withhold your voice from a call that used your name. You also had to withhold, as best a frightened person could manage, the small flicker of hope that rises automatically in the chest at the sound of someone beloved. Because that flicker, her grandmother said, was itself a kind of scent, a signal the hunger could follow even through silence, even through a held breath and a bitten collar. Pamela admitted, sitting in that clinic bed with her blackened fingers wrapped and elevated, that she did not know how a person was supposed to control a flicker of hope any better than they could control their own pulse, and that this, more than any claw mark or any missing companion, was the detail from that week she expected to carry the longest. By the 6th day, with 3 members of the original party still unaccounted for and a cold front now fully settled over the range, dropping 4 inches of early snow across the high basins, the search coordinator made the call that every ranger dreads making. Ground teams would continue, but the window for finding Frank, Martha, and Zachary alive was closing faster than any of us wanted to say aloud over the radio, where anything, we had all learned by then, might be listening. Gregory refused to be flown out with the others. He said he had led those 3 people into that basin and he would not leave it until he had walked every drainage himself. And though procedure gave me every authority to order him out under threat of losing his guiding permit, I did not give that order. I have thought since about why I let him stay, And the honest answer is that I recognized something in him I recognized in myself, a stubbornness that has less to do with courage than with an unwillingness to let the country win the argument about who gets to walk away whole and who does not. We moved together on the 7th day, just the two of us and a young seasonal ranger named Ortiz, up along the drainage where Zachary's empty boots had been found, following a set of the wrong-shaped prints that the snow had preserved with an almost surgical clarity. The stride length between prints measured, by my own tape, just over 7 feet, a distance that no bipedal animal known to this continent should have been capable of covering without leaving some sign of a running gait, a forward lean, a scuffed push-off point. These prints looked as though something had simply been placed, one after another, 7 feet apart, by a weight that did not need to build momentum the way a running body does. We found Zachary Howard's body shortly before noon, wedged into a crevice between two boulders in a position that Ortiz, kneeling beside it with his hand pressed over his own mouth, described afterward as almost peaceful, almost deliberately arranged, the way you might tuck a child into a small space to keep them warm. The cause of death, the medical examiner would later determine, was hypothermia complicated by a series of lacerations along both shoulders that had not been fatal on their own. He had likely lived through most of 2 additional nights out there before the cold finished what the claws had started, which is a detail I have never been able to make peace with, no matter how many times I have turned it over. There was no immediate sign of Frank or Martha, but Gregory, standing over Zachary's body with an expression I will not try to describe because I do not think I have the right words for it, said something to Ortiz and me that I wrote down almost verbatim in my log that night, because it was the first time anyone had said aloud the theory that had been circling the edges of all our thinking since the 4th camp. "It does not hunt like a predator hunts," Gregory said. "A predator wants the meat and does not care what shape it wears to get it. This thing wants something else first. It wants the moment where you recognize a voice you love and you let your guard down because your body remembers trusting that voice faster than your mind can remember to be afraid. The meat only comes after. The meat is almost an afterthought." I asked him, because someone had to ask it plainly, what he thought it actually was. Stripped of every story his own mentor and every grandmother in every family along that corridor had ever told about it. He looked north, toward the ridge where the whistle had answered him 3 nights before, and he said only that the old families never called it by a single fixed name because a fixed name is a kind of net, and this thing has always been better at slipping nets than anything else in these mountains has ever been. We camped that night below the ridge, and Gregory kept the brass whistle in his closed fist the entire time, refusing to sound it even once, because he had decided, somewhere in the hours since Zachary's body, that using it again would only be teaching the thing a longer, cleaner recording of a sound it clearly wanted very badly to own completely. At 2 in the morning, Ortiz woke me with a hand on my shoulder and a face gone the color of old ash. Something was moving along the tree line 40 yards out, upright, tall, moving with that same unnervingly even stride, and it was in a voice built from some borrowed register that landed somewhere between Frank Richardson's careful engineer's cadence and something colder underneath it, calling out coordinates, grid references, the exact language a ranger uses on a radio, spoken aloud into the open night as though it had learned not only how a rescued person's family sounds but how a search team itself sounds when it believes it has finally found what it was looking for. Gregory did not move. Ortiz did not move. I did not move. And after perhaps 6 minutes of coordinates spoken in a dead man's careful voice, the sound withdrew back up the ridge and none of us slept again before dawn. We found Martha Cox on the 8th day, alive, 3 ridgelines north of where any reasonable search radius should have placed her, huddled inside a shallow rock overhang with her leather journal clutched against her chest and frostbite already blackening 2 fingers on her left hand. She had survived, by her own later account, by doing the one thing none of the rest of us had fully considered as a strategy rather than simple bad luck. She had stopped believing anything she heard. She told me, once she was stable enough to speak at length back at the district clinic, that somewhere around the 5th night alone she had made a decision that probably saved her life, and that she was not entirely certain even now had been the right one to make. She decided that she would no longer trust any voice at all, including, eventually, her own memory of what a safe voice was even supposed to sound like. When she heard Gregory calling her name from what should have been the search party's position, she did not run toward it, and she did not run away from it. She simply covered her ears with both hands, closed her eyes, and waited, because she had reasoned that a rescue, a real one, would eventually come close enough to touch her, and anything that needed her to walk toward it first was by definition not a rescue at all. That single insight, arrived at alone and freezing and half-starved on a mountainside, was in its own way the thematic key to everything Gregory had tried to teach the group before they ever left the trailhead. Do not answer the voice. Let it come to you or let it go. The moment you move toward a called name, you have already made yourself smaller and closer and easier to reach. Scott Torres, recovering at the clinic with his wrist set and his scalp stitched, asked to speak with me privately on the 9th day, and what he told me changed the shape of everything I had believed about how this thing operated. He said that in the fragments of memory he had recovered since his rescue, he now remembered, with growing clarity, a moment on the 4th night. The night Frank and Hannah's radio call went out, when he had woken briefly to see Frank sitting upright at the edge of camp, radio in hand, speaking calmly into the handset in a voice that sounded almost entirely normal. Scott had assumed, half asleep, that Frank was simply making the scheduled evening call early. It was only weeks later, listening to a partial transcript investigators had managed to recover from the damaged radio, that Scott realized Frank had not been calling the ranger station that night at all. He had been repeating, slowly and with visible confusion in his own voice, coordinates and names that no living person had given him, as though something standing just outside the firelight had been feeding him the words to speak one syllable at a time, using Frank's own throat as the instrument, the way a hand uses a glove. That detail reframed the 11-minute recording I had found in the wrecked radio housing days earlier, the one I had never made it past 9 minutes of. I understood, hearing Scott's account, that what I had been listening to on repeat in the quiet of the ranger station was not simply Frank's death. It was the sound of something learning to speak fluently in a stolen voice, rehearsing the cadence of a man who would not live to hear the final performance. We never recovered Frank Richardson's body. Search efforts continued for another 11 days before weather and the encroaching interior winter forced a suspension, and to this date his case remains open in a file drawer at the district office, one line among several in the park's long, quiet history of names that went into the backcountry and did not come fully back out. Hannah Cooper was the one thread none of us had managed to pull loose from that basin, and by the 9th day I had begun to carry the particular dread that settles into a search commander when the mathematics of survival start working against you faster than the mathematics of hope. 9 days without water discipline, without adequate shelter, in a range where the overnight temperature had dropped well below freezing on 4 separate occasions, should have already written her ending for her. And yet something about the way this whole account had unfolded, voice after borrowed voice, rule after half-understood rule, told me that Hannah's story was not going to end the way a simple survival statistic would predict. Gregory and I found her on the 10th morning, in a narrow defile above the same ridge where the whistle had once answered him with 3 notes too clean to be honest. And when we found her, she was not hiding and she was not running. She was sitting cross-legged in the snow with her back against a slab of exposed granite, and she was, in a low, steady voice, counting. Not words, numbers. She had reached, by my own estimate listening from 30 yards out, somewhere past 4,000, and she did not stop counting even as we approached, even as Gregory called her name softly across the open ground. She told us later, once we had gotten warm layers onto her and a fire built close enough to push back the worst of the cold, that she had discovered on the 6th night that numbers were the one thing the voice in the trees could never quite steal from her. It could borrow Frank's cadence and Deborah's husband's nickname and her own mother's half-remembered lullaby dialect, but numbers belonged to no one specifically enough to be stolen, and so she had built herself a fortress out of simple counting, one integer at a time, refusing to let a single word slip past her lips that the thing circling her position might someday learn to wear. She had heard Frank's voice most nights, she said, patient, wounded-sounding, asking her again and again to come find him, to bring the others, to hurry because he was cold and could not walk on his own. She said the hardest night had not been the coldest one. The hardest night had been the 4th, when the voice calling for her had stopped sounding like Frank at all and had started sounding like Gregory, using Gregory's exact rhythm of speech, telling her that the danger had passed and that it was finally safe to answer. She had not answered. She had counted through it, 4,000 and more, one digit at a time, and I understood, listening to her account with Gregory sitting silent and pale beside the fire, that we had been wrong from the very start about what Gregory's old rule was actually protecting people from. It was never really about a name, A name was simply the easiest door for the thing to walk through, the shortest path into the part of a person that still wanted, more than it wanted, safety, to believe that someone who loved them was close by and calling. Gregory reached into his jacket and closed his hand around the brass whistle, and for the first time since Zachary's body, he raised it to his lips and blew 3 short notes, deliberately uneven, letting his own breath catch audibly in the middle note, the way Harlan had taught him a real human lung always will. He wanted Hannah to hear, with her own ears, the difference between a sound with a person's imperfection built into it and the flawless, borrowed copy that had been hunting all 8 of them through that basin for 10 days. It was in the silence that followed his 3 notes that we heard it answer. From somewhere above the defile, and this time it did not attempt 3 clean notes at all. This time it produced, out of some throat that should not have been capable of the trick, 3 notes with a small, deliberate waver built into the middle one. An imitation not of the whistle anymore but of Gregory's own imperfection, learned, we understood, with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. From the very demonstration he had just given it. Gregory did not sound the whistle again. He put it back inside his jacket, took Hannah's arm, and began walking her down toward the waiting helicopter without another word. And I followed them with my rifle raised and my radio silent, because I no longer trusted a single sound that basin was capable of producing, including by that point my own voice inside my own skull. The walk down from the defile to the landing zone took the better part of 2 hours, and I have never in 11 seasons felt a distance stretch the way that one stretched. Every step measured against the possibility that something behind us had decided the lesson it had just learned was worth testing immediately rather than later. Hannah walked between Gregory and me without speaking, her hands still curled loosely at her sides in the shape they had held while counting, as though her body had not yet been informed that the counting could stop. Partway down, we crossed the frozen margin of a small tarn, its surface skinned over with the first true ice of the season, and Gregory stopped there longer than the terrain required. He crouched at the edge of the water and looked at his own reflection, distorted through a half-inch of new ice, and he said something to me that I did not fully understand until much later, turning it over on long drives home the way I had turned over the radio recording. He said that Harlan, all those years ago, had never once claimed the whistle would stop the thing from following. Harlan had only ever claimed it would tell you the truth about what you were looking at, and that the truth, once you had it, was yours to decide what to do with. Some people used that truth to run. Some people, Harlan had told him, used it to finally understand that the running had never worked in the first place, and that the only real defense this country had ever offered anyone was the discipline to keep your own voice, your own name, your own grief, close enough to your chest that nothing wearing a borrowed shape could ever get a clean hold of it. I asked him what he meant by grief specifically, because none of the folklore he had shared with me before that morning had mentioned grief as a mechanism at all, only names and voices and the danger of answering. He looked past me, toward the ridge where the 3 uneven notes had come from, and he said that in his experience, and in Harlan's before him, and in the experience of every family along that corridor who had ever lost someone to those hills, the thing seemed drawn hardest to whoever in a given group was carrying the heaviest unspoken sorrow. Deborah, who had buried a husband 2 winters before. Pamela, who had outlived a mother whose language she had let slip away from her own tongue out of grief too large to keep visiting. Hannah herself, who had confided in Gregory on the second night of the trip, quietly by the fire, that she had come to Denali that September specifically because her own father had died in the spring and she had not yet found a single hour since the funeral in which she had allowed herself to properly fall apart. It does not create the sorrow, Gregory said. It only ever finds the sorrow that was already there, unattended, and it moves into that unattended space the way water moves into any crack a person forgets to seal. We reached the landing zone as the light was starting to fail, and the helicopter crew loaded Hannah first, wrapped in 2 thermal blankets, her eyes tracking the tree line the entire time with the flat, unblinking vigilance of someone who has learned in the space of 10 days that safety is not a location. It is a temporary and fragile agreement that the world can revoke at any moment it chooses. We flew Hannah and Gregory out that afternoon under a sky already thickening with the season's first real snowfall, and the search for Frank Richardson was formally suspended 6 days later, his case folder placed in the same drawer that holds every other name this park has kept for itself over the decades I have worked here. I want to tell you that the whistle protected them, that Harlan's old trick held the line and sent something ancient and hungry back into the hills defeated. I cannot tell you that, because 6 weeks later, on a routine winter patrol along a stretch of road closed to all but administrative traffic, my own truck radio crackled once, briefly, and produced 3 short notes, slightly uneven. The middle one catching just the way a real breath catches before the static swallowed it whole again. I have not told Gregory. I do not know if I ever will. Some rules, once you understand what they were really protecting you from, are not comforts anymore. They are confessions that the thing you were taught to fear was never really out there in the trees at all. It was already inside the sound of your own name, waiting patiently for someone, anyone, to finally answer. If Denali is not cold enough for you yet, if you need one more account before you sleep tonight, subscribe to Sir Belecho, subscribe to Mr. Belecho, and subscribe to Mr. Geronimo, because there are other whistles out there.